This is the last will and testament of me, Lady Margaret Wynne Brockmere, of Brockmere Hall in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine, in the county of Salop, on the Welsh marches, made this 14th day of August, in the year of our Lord 1819, being 77 years of age, and of sound mind and disposing memory. I revoke all wills heretofore by me made, and declare this to be my last. I give and devise my dwelling house called Brockmere Hall, with the park, the home farm, the rectory at Vowson, and all messuages and hereditaments thereto belonging, being together 414 acres in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine, unto my great niece, Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan, only daughter of my late niece, Mrs. Cordelia Trevelyan, born as Brockmere, deceased the 3rd of April 1810, to hold to the said Miss Eleanor Trevelyan, her heirs and assigns for ever, in fee simple, absolute, free of all encumbrances. I give and bequeath to the said Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan the further sum of £4,250 in the 3% consolidated annuities at present, standing in my name at the Bank of England, together with the contents of the South Library at Brockmere Hall, being 423 volumes by my late father's count of November 1798, the Brockmere family plate of 148 pieces, and the small portrait of my late mother by Sir William Beechey, lately hanging above the South Library fireplace. I ask my great niece's pardon for not having sought her out in her infancy or in her young womanhood. The fault of these 21 years of silence is entirely my own. Witness my hand and seal this 14th day of August 1819. Margaret Wynne Brockmere. Witnesses: Geoffrey Penlow, solicitor; Henrietta Yardley, housekeeper. The reading ended. The paper was laid flat upon the green baize writing table. A coal settled in the grate, and was the only sound for some seconds together. The young woman seated in the leather chair opposite the solicitor did not stir. Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan, 22 years of age, small and composed, dark chestnut hair pinned plain beneath a quiet black bonnet, eyes the colour of slate after rain. She wore the dove-grey half-mourning gown of one whose nearer mourning had been laid by some month since for a country journey. Her gloved hands were folded upon her reticule. She had heard the reading through without once shifting her position in the chair. Her chin had not lifted, nor had it dropped. She drew one breath. She let it out. "Mr. Penlow," she said, "I should be obliged if you would explain to me what has happened." Mr. Penlow of Lincoln's Inn, 61 years of age, thinning silver-grey hair carefully combed back, grave grey eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles, fair indoor pallor, long narrow scholar's face clean-shaven, thin 5'11" upright with a slight stoop, in unadorned black superfine white cravat, black silk waistcoat, charcoal pantaloons, polished black shoes, inclined his head with the gravity proper to such an hour. He set the engrossed will sober upon the green baize, drew the second sealed envelope half an inch toward his own elbow, and folded his hands one over the other in a manner he had practised these 33 years at the bar. He observed in candid, sober gravity that he would do so at once. "Your late great-aunt," he said, "Lady Margaret Wynne Brockmere of Brockmere Hall, departed this life upon Monday the 27th of December last, in the 77th year of her age, of a long, sedate, autumnal decline of 9 months' duration. She died in her own chamber at the south wing of the hall at 4:30 in the afternoon, with Mrs. Yardley, her housekeeper of 22 years, at her bedside, and Reverend Wenlock of St. Llanfair's at Llanfair-Waterdine, having read the appointed prayers an hour before. She had been, to the last, sensible and collected. She left her affairs in proper order. Eleanor inclined her head a single degree. She did not speak. Mr. Penlow acquiesced in her silence and went forward. He had supposed, upon the receipt of Lady Margaret's first instructing letter in the July of the preceding year, that the intelligence he should one day be commissioned to deliver into a Bath schoolroom would be received with some violence of feeling, either of resentment for the years of neglect, or of a young woman's natural agitation upon the receipt of a large, unexpected fortune. He had been at pains to prepare himself for either case. He had prepared, in his own grave forensic manner, the several sentences by which he should answer either form of feeling. He found at the present hour that he had no occasion to use them. Miss Trevelyan's gloved hands had not stirred upon her reticule. Her chin had not lifted. He had attended, in his 33 years at the bar, at perhaps a dozen such hours, and he had not before been required to render his explanation to a hearer of so judicious a deportment as the present. You will, Miss Trevelyan, be sensible that the Brockmere line and your own are nearly related, though the connection has not been kept up in your lifetime. Lady Margaret had one sister only, Mrs. Henrietta Brockmere, who married in 1769 her first cousin, Mr. Cuthbert Brockmere of Powys. Their only surviving daughter, your late mother, Mrs. Cordelia Brockmere, was born at Brockmere Hall in the August of 1774. She was Lady Margaret's only niece, and her especial darling through the years of her girlhood at the Hall. He paused, lifted his spectacles a fraction, and proceeded with the candour that the hour entreated of him. In the summer of 1795, your late mother, being then in her 21st year, formed an attachment to the Reverend Cuthbert Trevelyan, then a young man of 26, taking orders at Bath. Lady Margaret, I am sorry to inform you, did not approve the engagement. She judged Mr. Trevelyan, in her own phrase to me at the hour, too low for a Brockmere. She opposed the match in language that, she afterwards acknowledged in candid contrition, she ought never to have used. The two ladies quarrelled at Brockmere in the August of that year. Your late mother went down to Bath without her aunt's blessing, was married at St. Michael's at Walcot in the May of 1796, and never afterwards corresponded with Lady Margaret. The quarrel was not mended. They did not speak in 15 years. Eleanor's gloved hands moved a single half-inch upon her reticule. She inclined her head again, a second time, and again did not speak. Her father, the Reverend Cuthbert Trevelyan, had been a sober, amiable man, whose habit had not lain toward the rehearsal of old grievance. He had spoken to his only daughter of her mother's Brockmere kindred, not above twice in all her growing up at the Walcot curacy at Bath, and on both hours with the gentle candour of a curate who supposed the connection at an end, and who judged the recital of a quarrel he had himself been the unwitting occasion of to be the office of no man living. Eleanor had therefore received the particulars at the present hour with the gravity of one to whom they were entirely new. She did not pretend to herself, in the sedate self-possession of her own mind, that they were welcome. She did not pretend that they were unwelcome. She received them. Your honoured mother was carried off, as you know better than I, in the April of 1810, by a spring fever at Bath. The intelligence did not reach Lady Margaret until the September of 1812, 2 years and 5 months after the event, by a chance letter from a Bath acquaintance who had not known that the Brockmere ladies were estranged. Lady Margaret, upon receiving the intelligence, retired to her own chamber for the better part of a week. She did not communicate the fact of her great loss to the household. Mrs. Yardley afterwards informed me that the candle at her ladyship's writing-table burned through 3 successive nights without being snuffed. Eleanor's eyes lifted a fraction toward the window, then returned to the green baize. The window gave upon the gravelled walk of the old square at Lincoln's Inn. A leafless plane tree of moderate stature occupied the railed enclosure at the centre. A barrister of middle years in black silk gown crossed the gravel toward the hall, his bands very white at the throat against the January morning. Eleanor regarded him an instant, and then the green baize again. In the autumn of 1818, Mr. Penlow continued, Lady Margaret entreated me to make discreet inquiries through a Bath agent as to the circumstances of her late niece's only daughter. I ascertained in the November of that year that Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan, then in her 21st year, was second mistress at Mrs. Helmsford's reading school at 14 Pulteney Place, Bath, at an annual emolument of £40. The Reverend Cuthbert Trevelyan, your father, had died at Bath in the autumn of 1817 of a low autumn fever, having left a competency of £40 a year, on which his daughter had been subsisting these 3 years past. The agent represented to me that Miss Trevelyan was much esteemed by her employer, was of sedate and judicious habit, and was thought, by the elder pupils, a careful and amiable instructress. I conveyed all of this to Lady Margaret upon my return to Lincoln's Inn in the December of 1818. He drew the will copy half an inch toward himself with 2 fingers and then released it again. Upon receiving my report, Lady Margaret was, I venture to say, more affected than I had at any previous hour seen her. She remarked to me, I recall the phrase, for I set it down at the hour in my own commonplace book, "Mr. Penlow, I shall not undo at 76 the wrong of 23, but I shall do what is within my power at the present." She instructed me by candid letter dated the 1st of July 1819. The letter remains in my portfolio at this hour, of her intention to leave the Hall and the bulk of her property to your hand. The present will was executed at Brockmere on the 14th of August, 1819, in my own presence, and in that of Mrs. Yardley, as the second witness. Dr. Mountford, the parish apothecary, having attended her ladyship at the 11th of August, deposed at affidavit that she was on that day, and at the day of execution following, of sound mind and disposing memory. She died, as I have said, 19 weeks afterwards. Eleanor inclined her head a 3rd time. She drew one slow breath and let it out. "Mr. Penlow," she returned, in the sedate, sober voice that he had so far heard from her at this hour, "I am obliged to you for the particulars. I had not, until I received your letter of the 28th of December, been sensible that my great-aunt was acquainted with my existence. I had supposed her, if I had supposed of her at all, which through my mother's silence and my father's I had not been at habit to do, to be a great lady at the Welsh marches, who had set my mother aside in the August of 1795, and had not afterwards thought of her. I am gratified to learn that the case was otherwise. I shall hold the intelligence in candid remembrance." She paused a moment, the gloved hands resettling once upon the reticule. "Mr. Penlow, did my great-aunt leave any private letter to me with the will?" "She did, Miss Trevelyan," he answered, and laid his hand upon the second envelope. "Sealed within the present envelope, in her own hand. I had been instructed to give it into your hand at the present hour, without the breaking of the seal." He lifted it and held it across the green baize. She received it in her gloved hand, regarded the seal a single instant, the Brockmere stag's head in candid red wax, and then set it within the inner pocket of her dove-grey pelisse against her side. She did not break the seal. She was sensible that to break it at this writing-table, in the presence of Mr. Penlow, in a room not her own, would be to admit the elder solicitor to a recital that her great-aunt had addressed to her alone. She judged the seal proper to her own candle at the boarding-house that evening, and not before. "I thank you, Mr. Penlow," she said. He acquiesced and returned to the practical matters. Probate upon the will was granted at Doctors' Commons upon the 30th of December last, he observed, the formalities having been hastened, at my own pressing, by the kindness of the registrar there, who was an old acquaintance of mine at the bar. The estate is therefore at this hour vested in your hand, absolute. The Brockmere household at the Hall awaits your coming at your own convenient hour. Mrs. Yardley sends, by my own hand, her welcome to the new mistress. She has written, in proper form, a sober brief letter of welcome, which I shall deliver to you at the close of our present interview. Mr. Brand the steward sends the same, Mr. Lockstone the butler the same. The household has been put into mourning black at the date of her ladyship's death, and shall so remain until the parish has read the second Sunday after Easter." Eleanor inclined her head. He proceeded with the further particulars of the estate, at a sober, regular pace. The funded annuities in the 3% consolidated stock at the Bank of England would be transferred at her direction at the convenient hour after her arrival at the Hall. He would forward to her, at Brockmere, within the fortnight, the transfer forms and the certified extract of the will under the doctor's common seal, the Brockmere quarter-day rents, the home farm at Mr. Penrice's tenancy at £180 per annum, the parish rectory rent at 15, the village tenement at 12, were paid quarterly at Lady Day, Midsummer, Michaelmas and Christmas. Mr. Brand the steward had collected the December quarter-day rents at the customary hour, and the receipts were lodged in the Hall's iron strong-box, pending her arrival. The household wages were settled by Mrs. Yardley quarterly at the same hours and stood at £198 per annum for the 11 indoor servants and the 4 outdoor. I have ventured, Miss Trevelyan, upon my own discretion and at no engagement of your hand, to reserve 2 seats upon the Holyhead mail coach for Wednesday next, the 12th of January, departing from the Bull and Mouth in Aldersgate at 6 in the morning. The journey to Shrewsbury occupies 36 hours, with 1 overnight at Birmingham. A hired post-chaise will carry you the last 40 miles westward from Shrewsbury through Bishop's Castle to Llanfairwaterdyne. I would propose, if it meet with your approval, that I see you into the mail coach upon that morning. You shall be received at the Hall upon the afternoon of Friday the 14th of January, where Mrs. Yardley and the household will be assembled at the south door for your coming. I am obliged to you, Mr. Penlow, she returned in candid acquiescence. Wednesday the 12th, at 6 o'clock from Aldersgate. I shall be there. I shall send a chair for you at Bayswater Terrace at 4:30 in the morning of that day. I thank you. He inclined and laid the second envelope, the Mrs. Yardley letter, and the engrossed will copy in a neat sober stack at her right hand. He drew across the writing table a brief note of the Brockmere quarter-day rents and the inventory dates, and entreated her to peruse them at her own convenient hour at the boarding-house that evening. The interview concluded at 5:20 past noon. Mr. Penlow attended her himself to the outer chambers, and her hired chair to the entry of Lincoln's Inn at the Old Square. She inclined to him at the chair, and he returned the inclination with the deliberate gravity of an elder solicitor, who had, in the course of his 33 years at the bar, attended at many such interviews, and had not before, he would afterwards remark to his own clerk, been so prepossessed in favour of any client at the very first. She returned to her boarding-house at Bayswater Terrace shortly after 1, Mrs. Withers's lodging-house, a sedate 4-storey brick at the western end of the terrace, where Eleanor had put up the previous Sunday evening at the customary 7 shillings and 6 a night, recommended to her by Mrs. Helmsford at Bath as a respectable house, frequented by single ladies of judicious habit upon brief London errands, received her in the entry hall with the candid civility of a landlady who had been put in possession by Mr. Penlow's own clerk of the general character of the errand. Eleanor inclined to Mrs. Withers, ascertained that her trunk had been carried up to the second-floor back chamber, and went up to her room without further conversation. She laid the engrossed will copy upon the writing-table at the window. She laid the Mrs. Yardley letter beside it. She drew off her gloves and her bonnet. She seated herself at the upright cane-bottomed chair, and remained so for some minutes together, her gloved hands folded one upon the other in her lap, her eyes upon the leafless plane tree at the area railings in the street below. She did not weep. She had not wept since the September of 1817 at her late father's funeral, and she did not in this hour see the necessity. She was sensible only of a settled gravity at the heart, and an alteration whose figure she would not yet pretend to name. She took her dinner alone at the boarding-house parlour at 4. Mrs. Withers's table was sedate, and the cold mutton was passable. She drank 1 glass of small ale. 2 further lodgers were at the parlour at the hour. A sober elderly widow of the cloth from Norwich, in town upon the prosecution of her late husband's papers, and an amiable middle-aged maiden lady from Hertfordshire, upon a visit to a married sister at Camden, and Eleanor inclined to both at her entrance and her departure, but did not enter into conversation with either. She returned to her chamber at 5. The afternoon went down to early winter dusk. Mrs. Withers sent up a fresh candle and a fresh coal scuttle at 6:30, and the curtains were drawn. Eleanor seated herself at the writing-table at the window. She drew the second envelope from the inner pocket of her dove-grey pelisse, where it had lain against her side these 6 hours past. She broke the seal of red wax with her own thumb. The letter within was upon a single folded sheet of sober foolscap quarto, the hand sedate, sober, slightly tremulous at the 3rd line, and again at the 7th, but altogether candid and entirely legible. Brockmere Hall, the 15th of August, 1819. My dear great-niece, I have asked Mr. Penlow to deliver into your hand the within will and this present letter at the earliest convenient hour after my death. I beg you will permit me a sentence of apology for the silence of these 21 years. The wrong was mine entirely, and I do not seek to lessen it. Your honoured mother Cordelia, I had loved as my own daughter at Brockmere Hall through her girlhood. I taught her the modest Latin myself at the South Library window through the autumn of 1790, when she was at the age of 16, and she had what her own dear mother had been at pains to deny her, a sober delight in books. I have at the present hour no other proper redress within my power than to leave the hall to her only daughter. I hope you will think of Brockmere as your own. Mrs. Yardley shall acquaint you with all that I cannot. I am, my dear Eleanor, in the candid remembrance of your late mother, your great-aunt, Margaret Wynne Brockmere. Eleanor read it through once. She refolded it, very deliberate, and laid it at the candle. She drew toward her 2 sheets of writing paper, took up the pen, and dipped it in the inkstand. To Mrs. Helmsford at 14 Pulteney Place, Bath, she wrote a sober brief letter of resignation, proper in form, since she had given a month's notice in the November on her late great-aunt's expected death, being intimated to her by Mr. Penlow's inquiring letter of the 2nd of November. She thanked Mrs. Helmsford for the 3 years of her employment, regretted that she could not return at the Lady Day quarter, and entreated Mrs. Helmsford to convey her remembrances to the elder pupils. She sealed it with the boarding-house's red wax. To her cousin, Mrs. Vivian at Bath, a married cousin of her late father's, who had kept Eleanor's 2 trunks at her box-room at Henrietta Street through the December. She wrote a candid brief letter requesting that the trunks be sent up to Brockmere Hall in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine on the Welsh marches by the Shrewsbury carrier at the earliest convenient hour. She enclosed a half-sovereign against the carriage. She sealed this also. She set the 2 sealed letters at the corner of the writing-table for the morning post. She added, in a separate, sober note, a candid line of thanks to Mrs. Withers for the civility of the house, and an intimation that she would settle the week's reckoning before her departure for the Holyhead mail coach upon the Wednesday morning. She laid this 3rd note beside the others. She wiped the nib of the pen upon the small linen cloth Mrs. Withers had set at the inkstand, and returned the pen to its place at the candle. She returned to the engrossed will copy at her elbow. She read it through a 2nd time at the candle, with the sedate attention of one who had been brought up to read documents with care, and laid it sober upon the table beside the great-aunt's folded letter. The clock at the boarding-house landing-place struck the 9:15. The fire at the grate at her chamber settled in a single low articulation of call. It was 9:30 in the evening of Tuesday the 4th of January 1820. Outside, in Bayswater Terrace, a watchman's lantern went past in the street, and the call of the hour came up through the area. Eleanor inclined her head once toward the leafless plane tree at the railings, and once toward the letter folded at the candle. She drew one breath. She let it out. She did not weep. She was sensible of an alteration that she would not yet attempt to name. The Bayswater boarding-house lay at the edge of the dark winter dawn, and the bells of St. Clement's were just striking the half-hour after 5 when Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan came down the narrow staircase with her gloved hand at the rail. Her travelling trunk had gone down the night before, and stood at the front passage beside her leather portmanteau and her reticule. Mrs. Bidgood, the landlady, was up to see her off. She had laid out a cold breakfast at the front parlour, bread and butter and a fresh boiled egg, and had filled a stoppered flask with hot tea. Eleanor took the bread and the egg in sedate appetite, drew on her dove-grey wool pelisse over the half-mourning gown, settled the black bonnet at the chin, and gathered up her reticule with Cowper's Task in its inner pocket and the cloth-bound Welsh dictionary at the other side. She paid the 4 and 6pence owing and acknowledged Mrs. Bidgood's wish of a fair journey with a candid inclination of the head. The hackney Mr. Penlow had ordered was at the front step at 5:20 past 5. The streets between Bayswater and Aldersgate ran dark and almost empty, only the watchman at his box and a brewer's dray rumbling east. The pavement was rimed with hoarfrost, the breath of the horse stood white at the bit. Eleanor sat upright, with her gloved hands folded upon her reticule. She was sensible that this was the last hour of her London journey. She had been bequeathed a house in the Welsh marches that she had never seen by a great-aunt she had never met. She had heard the will read at Lincoln's Inn upon a clear Tuesday morning. She had written her resignation to Mrs. Helmsford and her letter to her cousin at Bath. She had opened the second envelope 2 evenings past and read the candid hand of Lady Margaret through. The hackney drew up at the Bull and Mouth in Aldersgate at 5 minutes before 6. The yard was lit by hanging oil lamps and was full of mail-coach bustle, horses being put to the 4 traces, guards in scarlet coats checking their blunderbusses, ostlers with feed buckets. Mr. Penlow was at the yard gate in his black, superfine and caped greatcoat, silver-grey hair carefully combed back beneath his black beaver hat. He stepped to the hackney door and handed her down himself. He had reserved her an inside seat against the door, the warmest for a January journey, and paid the fare in advance, £3.12 to Shrewsbury, with the post-chaise from Shrewsbury onward to be hired at the Lion. He gave her the booking ticket, a folded sheet of the stops with the principal inns, and a candid leather pocket-book with the Brockmere direction and the names of Mr. Lockstone the butler and Mrs. Yardley the housekeeper. "Miss Trevelyan," said Mr. Penlow, his grey eyes grave behind the gold-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Hadley the landlord at the Lion knows my hand. The road westward through Bishop's Castle to Llanfair Waterdine is 36 miles. You shall have light from Shrewsbury at 8:30 on Friday morning, and be at Brockmere by 4 in the afternoon. Mr. Penlow, I am obliged to you. Miss Trevelyan, I had served your great-aunt these 19 years. I am gratified to serve her great-niece." The guard called the hour. Eleanor took her seat. 3 other inside passengers, a sober middle-aged gentleman in clerical black, a stout matron of 50 with a basket, and a thin young man with a portfolio, settled themselves opposite. The whip cracked. The 4 bays drew the heavy mail coach out of the yard at 6 to the minute, and the bells of St. Botolph were sounding the hour as they wheeled into the street and turned northward toward Islington and the Great North Road. The dawn lifted as the coach drew clear of the metropolis. By Highgate, the eastern sky had risen to a thin pale blue with a bar of rose at the horizon. The metalled road ran fair beneath the wheels. The 4 horses kept their sedate trot. The guard's horn sounded at every turnpike gate. Eleanor drew Cowper's task from her reticule at 7:30 and read by the cold daylight at the right-hand window. The clerical gentleman opposite observed in candid courtesy that it was a fine choice for a winter journey. She acknowledged the remark with a sedate inclination of the head. They came into St. Albans at 9:30 and drew up at the Peahen in the High Street for the customary mail coach breakfast: strong tea, hot rolls, broiled bacon, eggs. Eleanor took the tea and a roll and an egg at the corner table. She wrote 3 sentences in her commonplace book: The Hour, the Inn, a sober observation upon the candid civility of the clerical gentleman, whose name she had learned to be Mr. Hadlow, a curate at Lichfield going home to his parish. She was back at the coach by 10. The road to Coventry ran 64 miles by Dunstable and Stony Stratford and Daventry. The morning held cold and clear. The hedgerows stood leafless and rimed. The ploughed fields lay dark beneath the frost. Eleanor read Cowper through the morning and laid the volume at her knee at noon to look out at the rural prospect. She had been born in Bath and had spent the whole of her 22 years between Bath and Walcot. She observed the rolling pasture and the leafless oak coppices and the rooks at the elm tops with candid, sedate attention. They came into Coventry at 4. The cathedral bells were ringing as the mail drew up at the King's Head in Smithford Street. Dinner was the customary mail coach hour: boiled mutton and turnips, pigeon pie, apple tart with custard. The clerical gentleman left them. A Birmingham linen draper took his place. She wrote 4 sentences in her commonplace book: the cathedral spire seen against the western sky, the candid courtesy of the inn-maid, the price of the dinner. The coach changed at Coventry, 4 fresh greys for the bays, and rolled out at 5. The dark came down at the 2nd milestone. The road to Birmingham ran 19 miles, and they made it in 3 hours by the carriage lamps. Eleanor sat upright at her corner, with her travelling cloak drawn close. They reached the Hen and Chickens in New Street, Birmingham at 8, the customary mail coach overnight stop for the Holyhead route. Eleanor was shown to a private chamber by a civil chambermaid, and at 8:30 came down for a sober supper of cold chicken and tea. She wrote a half-page in her commonplace book: the rate of the chamber at 3 and 6pence, the candid, pleasant manner of the chambermaid. She was asleep by 9:30, and woke at 4. Thursday, 13th. January dawned in Birmingham at a thick, low grey with a damp west wind. Eleanor took her breakfast at 4:30, paid her chamber rent and breakfast at 6 shillings together, and was at the coach by 5. The mail rolled out at 5:20 through Wolverhampton and Shifnal. She opened Maria Edgeworth's Patronage at the first chapter and read by the dim carriage lamp until the dawn at 7:30. The Black Country lay east, the ironworks and coal pits at Bilston and Dudley, sending dark plumes against the grey morning. Eleanor observed the smoke and the spoil heaps with sedate attention and noted them at Wolverhampton. By Shifnal, the prospect had cleared to candid Salopian pasture and broken hedgerow. She read Edgeworth through the morning. They came into Shrewsbury at 4. The mail drew up at the Lion in Weil Cop, the principal posting inn of the town. Mr. Hadley the landlord was at the front yard. Eleanor presented Mr. Penlow's pocket-book and inquired for a post-chaise to Lanvere Waterdine for the morning. Mr. Hadley engaged her a pair-horse chaise with a Salopian postilion named Tom Whittle. Eleanor took a private parlour, her chamber, her supper. She drew from her reticule the cloth-bound Welsh dictionary Mr. Penlow had bought her at Hatchard's, and read through the first 20 pages, the parish words, the household words, the church words, and copied a dozen of them into her commonplace book. She slept at the Lion in a sedate, dreamless sleep from 10 to 5. Friday, 14th January, dawned at Shrewsbury in a cold, pale blue, clear sky. Eleanor was up at 5, breakfasted at 6. The post-chaise was at the front yard at 8:20, the leather portmanteau strapped at the boot. Her trunk had gone forward by the carrier and would arrive at Brockmere on the Saturday. Tom Whittle put the pair to a sedate canter out of the Lion Yard and over the English Bridge to the west. The road ran south of west through Baston Hill and Dorrington and Pulverbatch, out of the Severn Valley and up into the Salopian Hills. They came up to the high pass above Bishop's Castle at noon. The hills opened on either hand, open bracken-brown slopes with sheep at the high pasture and the dark green of the firs, and the prospect westward dropped away to the long blue line of the Radnorshire Hills beyond the River Tym. Eleanor lowered the window and looked out a full 2 minutes. She had not been at this elevation in her life. The wind held the candid scent of bracken and sheep and turned earth. They drew into Bishop's Castle at 1 and stopped a half-hour at the Castle Hotel for Tom Whittle to bait the pair and for Eleanor to take a sober dinner of cold beef and bread and cheese. She opened the Welsh dictionary and read the parish names of the Western Marches: Llanfair, Llanfair, Llandrindod, Llangollen, Llanheadr. She practiced the pronunciation in sedate undertones at her ear. They were at the Shares again at 1:30, and away through Lidham and Clun Forest. They forded the Upper Clun at 3. By 3:30, they were at the Tym at Knighton, and Tom Whittle pointed at the long blue rise of hills to the southwest and observed in his Salopian voice that yonder lay Llanfair Waterdine and Brockmere Park. They came up to the lodge gates of Brockmere at 4 to the minute of Friday afternoon, 14th of January 1820. The afternoon was cold and pale blue and clear with a low westering winter sun upon the slopes. The lodge-keeper opened the iron gates at sight of the post-chaise and inclined gravely. Tom Whittle touched his hat and turned the pair up the long avenue. The avenue ran 400 yards from the lodge gates to the south sweep, a sedate ascending curve between a double row of mature beech and elm planted in 1689, at the same hour as the present house. The branches stood leafless against the pale blue sky. The rooks were at the upper twigs. The verge was rimed white. At the head of the avenue, the prospect opened upon Brockmere Hall. It stood on the south-facing slope, above the village of Llanfair Waterdine, 3 stories of ivy-clad limestone in the sedate manner of the latter Stuart age, a long south face of 7 bays, the upper floor windows mullioned in the older Salopian fashion, a low Doric portico over the south door. Built in 1689 by Sir Henry Brockmere, the 3rd baronet, upon the foundations of the older Tudor house. The west wing ran lower at 2 stories and held the household offices and the dairy. The east wing carried the south library at the ground floor and the late Lady Margaret's apartments above. The chimneys sent up thin grey smoke into the still cold afternoon. Beyond the hall, the Welsh marches stretched west into the blue Radnorshire Hills. The River Tym, the parish boundary, ran at the foot of the home park. The home farm lay half a mile north. Brockmere Coppice rose dark on the south slope. The whole prospect held the candid, sober dignity of a Salopian seat that had not been altered in the 130 years since it had been built. Eleanor looked at the hall a full 10 seconds without speaking. She was sensible of an alteration in herself that she would not yet attempt to name. She drew one breath. She let it out. She settled the bonnet at her chin and waited for Tom Whittle to bring the chaise up to the south sweep. The south sweep was a gravelled half-circle before the south portico. Tom Whittle drew up the chaise at 3 minutes past 4. A tall, thin, upright old gentleman in unadorned black butler's tailcoat, with white cravat, came down the 3 shallow limestone steps, opened the chaise door himself, set down the iron step, and offered his gloved hand. His grey eyes were finely lined and held a candid kindness. "Miss Trevelyan, ma'am. I am Lockstone, the butler of Brockmere. Mrs. Yardley is at the South Hall to receive you." Mr. Lockstone, 66 years of age, 41 years in service at Brockmere Hall, tall, 6 foot thin, upright, white hair brushed back from the fair, pale, indoor brow, kind grey eyes finely lined, in unadorned black butler's tailcoat with worn silver Brockmere buttons, clean white cravat, charcoal pantaloons, inclined deeply at her, the deeper inclination owed by an old servant to the new mistress upon her arrival. Eleanor inclined back in candid, grave courtesy. "Mr. Lockstone, I am obliged to you. I have heard your name from Mr. Penlow with great respect. Miss Trevelyan, the household has been making ready for your coming these 8 days. If you will be pleased to come within, Mrs. Yardley is at the South Hall." He gave the postilion a half-crown and directed him to the stable yard for the night. Mr. Lockstone offered his arm at the limestone step and led her up beneath the Doric portico into the South Hall. The South Hall ran the depth of the house and rose 2 stories to a panelled ceiling of dark Salopian oak, a black and white flagged floor, a great hearth at the east wall with a low coal fire, the late 7th Baronet's portrait above the mantel, an old long-case clock at the corner sounding the 4:15. Mrs. Yardley stood before the hearth, the chatelaine of keys at her hip. Behind her ranged Mrs. Pendlebury the cook, Miss Hattie Yardley her daughter, and 4 understaff in their Brockmere morning blacks. Mrs. Yardley dropped a sober rural curtsy of welcome. "Miss Trevelyan, ma'am. I am Yardley, the housekeeper of Brockmere. I had served your great-aunt Lady Margaret these 21 years. The household is at your direction." Mrs. Yardley, 62, 38 years in service. Iron grey hair beneath a clean white linen cap, sensible grey eyes very direct, slender 5'5" upright, in unadorned half-mourning dove-grey serge with clean white lawn fichu, held the candid sober dignity of the long-serving housekeeper. Eleanor inclined at her. "Mrs. Yardley, I am sensible of how long you have served this house. I shall be obliged if you will continue exactly as you have done in my great-aunt's time." "Ma'am, I shall," said Mrs. Yardley, inclining her head a second time with a kind rural gravity. "Mrs. Pendlebury, ma'am, is our cook, these 22 years past. Hattie is my own daughter, lately come back from her schoolmistress's post at Shrewsbury, upon her great-aunt's death, to keep me company. Sally, Bridget, Maggie and Tess at the back are our 4 under-housemaids. Mrs. Pendlebury, 54, soft grey-brown hair beneath a large white linen cap, kind warm hazel eyes, ruddy-cheeked in unadorned dark blue print cotton with clean white apron, dropped her curtsy with a candid, warm Salopian smile. Miss Hattie Yardley, 24, soft mid-brown hair, pinned smooth at the nape under a clean white lace cap, sensible hazel eyes, fair fine indoor skin, slender 5'5" upright, in unadorned dove-grey print cotton morning gown with clean white linen collar, gave a sober rural curtsy. The 4 under-housemaids curtsied together at the back. "I am obliged to each of you," said Eleanor, in a sedate, clear voice that carried in the flagged hall. "I shall not alter the household. Mrs. Yardley shall keep the keys. Mrs. Pendlebury shall keep the kitchen. Mr. Lockstone shall keep the door. I shall be at the south parlour at 6 for supper. Miss Yardley, I shall be obliged if you will sup with me there." Miss Hattie inclined her head. "Ma'am, with pleasure." Mrs. Yardley brought her up to the first floor. The great south chamber, the late Lady Margaret's apartments, stood open at the head of the stair, a wide bedchamber of 3 windows looking south over the home park, a 4-poster of carved Salopian oak hung in faded crimson damask. Eleanor stood at the threshold. "Mrs. Yardley," she said in candid, sedate gravity, "I had not meant to take my great-aunt's chamber upon arrival. I should be obliged if you will make up the smaller chamber in the north wing instead." Mrs. Yardley acquiesced at once. "Ma'am, it is rightly done. The north wing chamber is 2 doors along, a sober chamber of 1 window upon the home park, with a tester bed in the older manner. I shall have Sally lay the fire within the hour." Eleanor was shown to the north wing chamber, a tester bed in faded pale blue Welsh wool hangings, a writing table of dark oak at the single sash window, a dressing case of unadorned cherry wood, a hearth with a candid coal fire that Sally was already lighting. Mrs. Yardley brought up a basin of hot water and inquired of supper. Eleanor named 6. Eleanor stood a moment at the sash window. The home park ran south in the pale blue winter afternoon to the Thames. She washed at the basin, smoothed her hair at the dressing glass, and came down at 5 minutes before 6. The south parlour was a sedate panelled chamber at the southeast corner, 2 windows looking south over the park, a coal fire at the hearth, a candle-lit oval table laid for 2. Mrs. Pendlebury had set a sober supper: cold mutton, pickled red cabbage, a fresh wheaten loaf, fresh butter, Cheshire cheese, and a candid apple pie of last autumn's russets. Miss Hattie was at the door at 5 minutes past 6. "Miss Trevelyan, I am obliged to you for the invitation, ma'am." "Miss Yardley, pray be seated. I would rather sup at company than at my own." They sat together at the candle-lit oval table. They spoke first of the journey: Mr. Hadlow the curate, the Black Country smoke, the Bishop's Castle pass, and then of Brockmere itself. Miss Hattie observed in her candid Salopian way that the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine held 17 tenant farms and 84 parish souls, half English and half Welsh-speaking, that Reverend Wenlock had served St. Llanfair's these 18 years, that Mr. Brand the steward had served Lady Margaret 29 years and would call in the morning at 10, that the home farm was let to Mr. Penrice at £180 the year. Eleanor listened in candid, sedate attention. After supper, they sat at the parlour fire half an hour together. Eleanor observed that the South Library reading hour was something she would wish to share at the 7 to 9 evening hour if Miss Hattie would oblige her. Miss Hattie inclined her head, with a candid, gratified flush. At 9, Eleanor took her candle and went up to the north wing chamber. She wrote a single page in her commonplace book, the hour of her arrival, the candid welcome of the household, the names of those she had met. She knelt at her bedside in the older Trevelyan fashion and said her sober evening prayers. She was at her pillow by 9:30. Saturday morning, 15th of January, dawned at Brockmere in a cold, pale blue, clear sky. Mrs. Yardley brought up the household keys at 9 and walked her through the South Library, 423 volumes at the catalogue of November 1798, and the 6 reception rooms and the 14 bedchambers and the household offices at the West Wing. The leather-bound house inventory of 218 pages stood at the South Library writing table, kept current at Mrs. Yardley's hand at each quarter-day since 1799. At 10, Mr. Brand the steward called at the south door. Mr. Lockstone showed him up to the South Library. He came in his unadorned olive-drab country coat over his unadorned buff waistcoat, his sturdy 5'10" figure upright, soft grey-brown hair just brushing his collar, candid hazel eyes very direct, faintly tanned from estate riding, 58 years of age, 29 years at the home farm. "Miss Trevelyan, ma'am, I am Brand, steward of Brockmere. I have brought up the estate book at Mrs. Yardley's direction. Mr. Brand, I am obliged to you. Pray be seated." They sat at the South Library writing table half an hour at the estate book, then walked out at the south sweep to view the home park. The morning was cold and pale blue, with a thin wind off the Radnorshire hills. The home park ran 312 acres in a sedate slope to the Thames. The home farm of 102 acres lay under tenancy to Mr. Penrice at £180 the year. Brockmere Coppice of 32 acres rose dark on the south slope. The south meadow of 18 acres lay between the avenue and the Thames. The parish rectory drew its advowson at the Brockmere gift. Total: 414 acres in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine. Mr. Brand walked her the length of the park in sedate, sober narration. Eleanor took candid notes at a folded sheet at her reticule. They came back at the south sweep at noon. Mr. Brand acknowledged her direction that he should call at 1 o'clock on Mondays and Thursdays through the spring to walk the park together. He took his leave with a candid, sober inclination at the south door. Sunday morning, 16th of January, dawned at Brockmere in a cold, clear, pale blue. Eleanor breakfasted at 8:30, dressed in her dove-grey wool half-morning gown, and walked down through the home park to the village at 10:20 with Mrs. Yardley 3 paces behind. The parish church of St. Lanvers stood at the foot of the home park lane upon the south bank of the Thames, a sedate, sober Salopian rural church of weathered limestone, a square west tower of 3 stages, a slate roof, a yew at the lych gate of perhaps 400 years' age. Reverend Wenlock met them at the lych gate. He was a sensible, amiable clergyman of 54, soft, sandy-grey hair, finely thinning, sensible blue-grey eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles, fair, gently weathered Welsh March's skin, long, kind, clean-shaven face, in unadorned black cassock with white linen surplice. He had served the parish 18 years, and inclined at her with a candid, sober welcome. "Miss Trevelyan, ma'am, Mrs. Yardley has been kind enough to send me word of your safe arrival on Friday. I am gratified to receive you at St. Lanvers." "Reverend Wenlock, I am obliged to you." The Brockmere pew was at the south aisle, a deep oak-panelled enclosure with a green baize cushion and a brass plate engraved with the Brockmere arms. Eleanor took her seat. Mrs. Yardley sat at her left, Miss Hattie at her right. The village congregation was perhaps 53 souls, sober rural farmers and their wives and children and farm servants in the back pews. The villagers regarded her with a sober rural curiosity that held no unfriendliness. Reverend Wenlock read the Epiphany service in a sensible, measured voice. The sermon was sober and brief, 15 minutes upon the Magi at Bethlehem and the candid gift of the recognition of a great inheritance not foreseen. Eleanor wondered, in candid, sedate amusement, whether the sermon had been written before her own arrival or after. She acknowledged Reverend Wenlock at the south porch and walked back to the hall at noon. Eleanor took her cold dinner at the south parlour at 1 and read Cowper at the south library hearth through the afternoon. The 2 weeks that followed were the candid forming of her habits. Mrs. Yardley walked her through the house inventory chapter by chapter. 14 bedchambers, 6 reception rooms, the south library of 423 volumes, the household plate of 148 pieces, the household linen of 315 articles, the dairy, the kitchen, the stable yard. The inventory was kept current at the quarter day, the next being Lady Day on the 25th of March. A sedate routine emerged by the second week. Eleanor was at the south library writing table at 9:30 each morning for the estate correspondence and the household account, and stayed at it till 12. She walked the home park with Mr. Brand at 1 on Mondays and Thursdays. She held the village reading class for 6 village girls at the parish school at 3 on Wednesdays and Fridays. Megan Pugh, Bethan Vaughan, Catty Lloyd, Andwyn Phillips, Gwyneth Williams, Jane Morgan, reading from Maria Edgeworth's Parents' Assistant at the candid pace Eleanor set them. She supped at the south parlour with Miss Hattie at 6, and read at the south library, reading hour from 7 to 9. She attended Sunday morning service at St. Lanvers at 10:30. The Welsh dictionary stayed at her reticule through the working day. She copied the parish Welsh words at her commonplace book at the evening hour, and practised them in sedate undertones. Mrs. Pendlebury observed in her candid Salopian way that the new mistress had picked up Bordar and Prinhorndar and Nostar inside her first fortnight. Sunday 30th. January 1820 dawned at Brockmere in a cold, clear, pale blue. Eleanor was at her customary breakfast at 8:30, walked down to St. Lanvers at 10:20 with Mrs. Yardley 3 paces behind, took her place at the Brockmere pew. heard Reverend Wenlock read the morning service in his sensible, measured voice. The villagers no longer regarded her with the curiosity of the first Sunday. She had become, in the candid Salopian fashion, the new mistress at Brockmere, sober, sensible, kind, candid in her courtesies, faithful at the pew. After service, Eleanor walked back along the Home Park lane to the hall, with Mrs. Yardley at 3 paces behind. The afternoon was cold and pale blue and clear. At the south door she stopped a moment beneath the Doric portico and looked west across the Welsh marches to the long blue line of the Radnorshire hills. The leafless beech and elm avenue ran south to the lodge gates. The Home Park lay sedate in the winter light. The dark coppice rose on the south slope. The River Thames caught a single thin gleam of the westering sun. She drew one breath, sober and candid. She was settled at Brockmere. Tuesday the 1st of February 1820 came up at Brockmere Hall in the cold, pale blue fashion of the Welsh Marches' winter, the frost lying white at the south sweep, and the rooks at the elms above the south library cawing in the still hour after sunrise. Eleanor had taken her usual place at the south library writing table at 9:30. The Brockmere account book open at her left elbow, a fresh sheet of foolscap laid before her, and Mrs. Yardley's quarter-day inventory at her right hand. The fire at the south library grate had been laid up by the under-housemaid at 7, and had now settled into a sober red bed of coals. Eleanor wore the unadorned dove-grey half-morning gown of her ordinary morning hour, with the clean white linen collar at the throat. Her chestnut hair was pinned in the customary fashion beneath the lace cap of her own ordering, and the slate-coloured eyes were settled upon the inventory page in candid concentration. At 10:30, Mr. Brand the steward came up the south library passage with the Morning Post in his hand. He gave the door a sober knock and was bidden enter. Mr. Brand was in his usual olive-drab estate coat over the buff waistcoat, his soft grey-brown hair brushed back, his candid hazel eyes very direct. "Miss Trevelyan," he observed, inclining sedately at the table. "The Morning Post from Bishop's Castle. 3 letters. There is one which I should bring to your particular attention." He laid the 3 letters before her on the green baize of the writing table, and indicated the uppermost. "It bears the seal of Furnival's Inn, ma'am." Eleanor took up the folded letter. The red wax was firm, the seal cut deep, an inn-of-court device she had not before seen at Brockmere. She turned the letter over once. It was directed in a careful clerk's hand to Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan, Brockmere Hall, in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine, by Bishop's Castle, Salop. "Thank you, Mr. Brand. I shall read it directly. Pray let Mrs. Yardley know that I shall be at the South Library until 12, and that I shall send down word if I have need of her." Mr. Brand inclined and went out. The door fell to behind him with the established Brockmere click of the iron latch. Eleanor laid her pen aside, broke the wax with a clean stroke of her ivory paper knife, and unfolded the sheet upon the green baize. The paper was good-ribbed laid stock, the hand a careful indoor clerk's italic in dark walnut ink. The date at the head was the 28th of January, 1820. The address block was Mr. Felton, of Furnival's Inn, London, barrister at law. She read the letter once through in candid, sober gravity, her gloveless hands settled upon the foolscap, her chin not lifting. She read it a second time through with the same fixed attention. Mr. Felton wrote, on behalf of his client, Sir Tarquin Brockmere of Powys in the county of Montgomery, to give Miss Trevelyan formal notice that Sir Tarquin intended at the earliest convenient hour to bring a proceeding in Chancery contesting the will of his late aunt, Lady Margaret Wynne Brockmere of Brockmere Hall, dated the 14th of August, 1819, and admitted to probate at Doctors' Commons on the 30th of December, 1819. 3 grounds were set forth. First, that the Brockmere settlement of 1769, had entailed the hall to the male line of the Brockmere family in perpetuity, and that the late Lady Margaret had been without power of devise as to the lands of Brockmere, the said lands devolving at her death upon her late younger brother's only son, the said Sir Tarquin, as heir under the settlement. Second, that the late Lady Margaret had been of unsound mind in the August of 1819 by reason of the lingering illness, whereof she had at length died on the 27th of December last, and that the said will of August 1819 was therefore void at law. Third, that the said will of August 1819 had been procured by the undue influence of Mr. Penlow of Lincoln's Inn and of Mrs. Henrietta Yardley, the housekeeper, each of whom had attended Lady Margaret at the execution and stood as witnesses upon the engrossment. Mr. Felton concluded, in a candid penultimate paragraph, that his client would suffer the proceeding to be withdrawn upon receipt from Miss Trevelyan of the sum of £6,000 in cash, together with an annuity of £400 a year charged upon the Brockmere estate during his client's natural life, and that his client awaited Miss Trevelyan's answer at her earliest convenience. Eleanor laid the letter at her left elbow upon the green baize. She drew one breath. She let it out. She did not weep. She did not stir from her chair. She set the inventory at the side, laid a fresh sheet of foolscap before her, dipped her pen, and wrote: Brockmere Hall, in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine, Salop, Tuesday, 1st February, 1820. My dear Mr. Penlow, I have this morning received by the post from Furnival's Inn the enclosed letter of Mr. Felton, barrister, dated the 28th of January last, on behalf of Sir Tarquin Brockmere of Powys. The letter notifies me of his intention to contest the will of my late great-aunt Lady Margaret Brockmere on 3 grounds, of which the third concerns yourself personally, and proposes a compromise of £6,000 cash and a £400 annuity in exchange for withdrawal. I should be obliged if you would come up to Brockmere at your earliest convenient hour. Mrs. Yardley shall make up the east chamber against your arrival. The mail coach for Shrewsbury sets out from the Bull and Mouth at 6 in the morning, and I expect you might be at Brockmere by the Friday afternoon following. I remain, with much regard, your obedient servant, Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan. She sanded the page, folded it about the Felton letter, sealed the packet with the small Brockmere wafer of dark green wax, and laid it ready for the afternoon post-rider. At 11:15 she rang for Mrs. Yardley. Mrs. Yardley came up the south library passage in her usual sensible fashion, her chatelaine at her hip, and stood at the writing-table at 3 paces. Mrs. Yardley, be so good as to make up the east chamber for Mr. Penlow against his coming up from London on Friday afternoon. He will bring his own valet. He shall take his breakfast at the south parlour with myself at 8:30 in the established Brockmere fashion. I should be obliged also if you would speak to Mrs. Pendlebury about the Friday dinner. Mr. Penlow is partial to a sober roast and a Salopian apple-tart of her best fashion. Yes, ma'am. The east chamber shall be aired and laid up by Thursday evening. Mrs. Pendlebury shall have the dinner in hand at her own convenience. And, Mrs. Yardley. Eleanor laid her hand upon the green baize at her left elbow. Sir Tarquin Brockmere of Powys has put forward, through a barrister at Furnival's Inn, a proposed proceeding contesting my great-aunt's will. I shall not give it any other answer than what the law gives. Mr. Penlow comes up at my invitation to settle the matter. I tell you because the third of his 3 grounds imputes undue influence to yourself as a witness upon the engrossment, and I will not have any whisper of it carried into the household by the back door. I shall not have you discomposed. Mrs. Yardley's sensible grey eyes did not waver. Miss Trevelyan, I attended Lady Margaret at her writing in this same library on the 14th of August. She read the engrossment through aloud. She signed at her own hand. I signed under her direction with Mr. Penlow at the other side of the table. There was no influence procured by myself or by any other in the room. I shall give that answer, ma'am, at any chamber in the kingdom that asks me, and I shall give it the same way at Mrs. Pendlebury's kitchen at 6 o'clock this evening, if any whisper come up through the household. Thank you, Mrs. Yardley. Mrs. Yardley inclined and went down. Eleanor sat a sedate minute together at the green baize and was sensible of the fixed Brockmere ground at her back. She returned to the foolscap and resumed the Brand farm accounts. The dressing bell sounded at noon. Eleanor put aside the account book, drew her morning shawl about her shoulders, and went down to her sedate dinner at the south parlour with Miss Hattie Yardley. She did not speak of the letter at the meal. She spoke instead of the parish school reading hour and of the parcel of new prints Reverend Wenlock had borrowed from Cardew. Mrs. Pendlebury's mutton was sober and good. The pale blue winter afternoon settled over the Welsh Marches Park. Friday the 4th of February came up cold and clear. Eleanor had risen at 7, walked the south terrace under the leafless beeches at 8, taken her breakfast at 9, and gone to the South Library at 9:30 in the established fashion. She wrote at the writing table all the morning at the household correspondence and the steward's accounts. At noon, she dined sedately with Miss Hattie. At 2, she returned to the South Library. At 3, she heard the wheels of the Shrewsbury mail coach upon the lane below the home park, distant and small in the cold air. At 4, the underfootmen came up to say that a hired chaise had been seen at the lodge gates. At 4:20, Mrs. Yardley showed Mr. Penlow up the South Library passage. Mr. Penlow came in, carrying his black leather portfolio under his right arm. He was in his usual unadorned black superfine over the dark waistcoat, the white cravat, fresh from his change at the lodge, the thinning silver-grey hair carefully combed back from his high forehead, the grave grey eyes behind the small gold-rimmed spectacles direct upon Eleanor at the writing table. He inclined deeply. Miss Trevelyan. Mr. Penlow. I am most obliged that you came up so soon. Pray sit down. He drew up the candid leather chair at the opposite side of the writing table. Mrs. Yardley sent up tea at 5. Eleanor laid Mr. Felton's letter before him on the green baize. Mr. Penlow took it up, drew his spectacles a little forward upon his nose, and read it through twice with a settled scholarly attention. He folded it once and laid it at his right hand. He drew from his portfolio a sober bundle of papers tied with red tape. Miss Trevelyan, he observed gravely, Sir Tarquin's proceeding is without foundation. The 3 grounds of the threatened bill in Chancery, cannot any of them be supported in law. I shall take them in their order. He laid his hand upon the topmost paper of the bundle, an old engrossed parchment that bore the dark seal tags of 1769. First, as to the entail. The Brockmere settlement of the 18th of May, 1769, was executed by your great-great-grandfather, Sir Cuthbert Brockmere, upon the occasion of the marriage of his elder daughter Henrietta to Mr. Brockmere, her first cousin. It is a strict settlement, drawn up by Mr. Lockyer of Furnival's Inn in the usual style. It is not, ma'am, perpetual. He turned the engrossment and indicated the operative habendum. The clause runs, to the use of the said Henrietta Brockmere, for her natural life, with remainder to the use of the heirs of her body, lawfully begotten in tail male, with remainder over to the use of the said Sir Cuthbert his heirs, and assigns for ever in fee simple absolute. The strict settlement, Miss Trevelyan, runs for 2 lives only. The first life, Mrs. Henrietta, expired in 1810 at her own death. The second life, her only daughter, your late mother, Mrs. Cordelia, expired in the spring of the same year. At the failure of male issue of Mrs. Henrietta in 1810, the entail was at an end. The fee simple absolute reverted to Sir Cuthbert his heirs and assigns. Lady Margaret, as the surviving heir general of Sir Cuthbert, took the Brockmere estate in fee simple absolute. She had, ma'am, full power of devise. Sir Tarquin's first ground, accordingly, fails upon the face of the settlement itself. Eleanor inclined gravely. I understand you, Mr. Penlow. Second, as to soundness of mind. He drew from the bundle a sober foolscap affidavit in his own careful italic. I attended Lady Margaret at the execution of the will at this very hall on the 14th of August, 1819, in the South Library where we now sit. I attest upon the engrossment of my affidavit, sworn before the Master in Chancery on the 2nd of January, 1820, in the words following: I, Geoffrey Penlow of Lincoln's Inn in the county of Middlesex, solicitor, do solemnly and sincerely affirm that on the 14th day of August 1819 I attended at Brockmere Hall in the parish of Llanfair Waterdine in the county of Salop upon Lady Margaret Wynne Brockmere, then in the 77th year of her age, for the purpose of the execution of her last will and testament, that the said Lady Margaret was upon that day of sound mind, memory, and understanding, that she read the engrossment of the said will through aloud at the South Library writing table in my presence and in the presence of Mrs. Henrietta Yardley, her housekeeper, that she signed and sealed the said will with her own hand at her ordinary fixed signature, that she gave the customary attesting instructions to myself and to the said Mrs. Yardley, and that she was throughout the execution sensible, candid, and entirely collected as to the nature and effect of the dispositions contained in the said will. He laid the affidavit on the green baize and drew up a second. I have also, Miss Trevelyan, the affidavit of Dr. Mountford, the Brockmere village apothecary of long acquaintance with Lady Margaret, sworn on the 11th of August 1819, 3 days before the execution, and lodged at Lincoln's Inn, with the engrossment, attesting in like fashion that Lady Margaret was at that hour of perfectly sound mind. The dating, you observe, is significant. The affidavit precedes the execution. It was sworn upon Lady Margaret's own instructions, against the possibility of any after-challenge from her late younger brother's son. She had foreseen Sir Tarquin's bill. She had taken her precaution. Sir Tarquin's second ground accordingly fails upon a sworn medical attestation taken at the very date of execution. Eleanor inclined again. And the third ground, Mr. Penlow. The third, ma'am, is the gravest as to its imputation upon myself and upon Mrs. Yardley, and the most readily disposed of upon the facts. He drew from the bundle a folded letter in Lady Margaret's own slanted Welsh marcher's hand on Brockmere ribbed laid stock. Lady Margaret instructed me by her candid letter of the 1st of July 1819, 6 weeks before the execution, of her settled intention as to the disposition of Brockmere and of the consolidated annuities. I read you the operative passage. My dear Mr. Penlow, pray draw up my will at the earliest convenient hour upon the following heads. I devise Brockmere Hall with the park and home farm, and all hereditaments thereto belonging to my great niece, Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan of Bath, only daughter of my late niece Cordelia, in fee simple absolute. I bequeath to her further the sum of £4,250 at the 3% at present, at the bank in my name, the contents of the South Library, the Brockmere family plate, and the beachy portrait of my late mother. I do this as the only proper redress for an injustice I have lately come to acknowledge as my own. Pray bring the engrossment down to Brockmere for execution at your convenience after the 1st of August. Yours faithfully, M. W. Brockmere. He laid the letter at the affidavit. The instructing letter, you will observe, ma'am, is in Lady Margaret's own hand, dated and addressed in her own hand, sealed at her own wafer, and is the prior intention of which the August execution is the candid formalization. Mrs. Yardley and I were the proper attesting witnesses. We were not, in any candid sense whatever, the procurers of the will. Sir Tarquin's third ground accordingly fails upon Lady Margaret's own prior written instruction 6 weeks before the execution. The undue influence imputed cannot be made to stand against a settled intention upon paper of so long a date and in so candid a hand. He laid his hands flat upon the green baize. The fire settled. Miss Trevelyan, Sir Tarquin's proceeding is without foundation in law. I shall answer Mr. Felton this afternoon in candid Lincoln's Inn fashion. I expect that on receipt of my answer, Mr. Felton will counsel his client to withdraw. Eleanor inclined gravely. Mr. Penlow, pray do. Mr. Penlow drafted his reply at the South Library writing table that same evening between 7 and 10, the candles set up at the green baize, the fire fed twice. He enclosed at the engrossed copy of his letter to Mr. Felton the 4 supporting papers: the 1769 settlement in transcript, Lady Margaret's letter of the 1st of July 1819 in transcript, Dr. Mountford's affidavit of the 11th of August 1819 in transcript, and his own attestation of the 2nd of January 1820. He sealed the packet at 10:30 and gave it to Mr. Lockstone for the Saturday morning post-rider to Bishop's Castle. Through the first week of February, there came an exchange of formal letters between Mr. Penlow at Brockmere and Mr. Felton at Furnival's Inn. Mr. Felton's first reply, dated Tuesday the 8th of February, was a candid acknowledgment of receipt and a request for 2 days' grace in which to take his client's instructions. Mr. Penlow granted the grace by return. Mr. Felton's second reply, dated Friday the 11th of February, was a candid embarrassment. He had, he wrote, laid the 4 supporting papers before his client at his chambers in Furnival's Inn on the Wednesday morning. His client had been disconcerted at the production of Lady Margaret's letter of the 1st of July 1819 and at Dr. Mountford's August affidavit. Mr. Felton had, in candid professional duty, advised his client that the first ground was not sustainable upon the face of the settlement, that the second ground was not sustainable against a sworn medical attestation of the date of execution, and that the third ground was not sustainable against the testatrix's own prior written instruction. He had advised his client to withdraw the proposed bill. His client had not as yet acquiesced. Mr. Felton would await Mr. Penlow's further communication. Mr. Penlow remained at Brockmere through the 4 days following Mr. Felton's letter at Eleanor's invitation. He took his breakfast at the South Parlour at 8:30, walked the South Terrace with Eleanor for a sober half-hour at 10, sat at the South Library at his own writing of opinions for Lincoln's Inn through the morning, dined at 1, walked again at 3, took tea at the South Parlour at 5, and read with Eleanor and Miss Hattie at the South Library reading hour from 7 to 9. He found Brockmere, as he candidly observed to Eleanor at the Saturday tea, much as Lady Margaret had kept it in her own time, and Eleanor's settled hand at the household no less candid than her late great-aunt's. Sunday the 13th of February came up grey and still, and unseasonably mild for the Welsh March's February. At 20 minutes past 11, a hired post-chaise was seen at the lodge gates, and at 11:30 it drew up at the south sweep. Mr. Lockstone met it at the south door. The visitor descended. He was a man of 53, florid, oily about the jowl, of medium 5'9" upright, with a soft paunch carried before him. The sandy, thinning hair had been carefully oiled forward over a high pink forehead. The sallow complexion was broken at the nose with the fine purple veins of indoor habits. He wore a dark bottle green wool tailcoat with worn gilt buttons over a primrose yellow silk waistcoat, slightly stained at the left lapel, buff pantaloons, top boots with brass tassels, a quizzing glass on a black silk ribbon at his lapel. He had not been announced. He had not been invited. He gave his name at Mr. Lockstone's inquiry as Sir Tarquin Brockmere of Powys, and demanded, in an oily indoor voice, to be shown up to his cousin, Miss Trevelyan. Mr. Lockstone, who had been forewarned by Mrs. Yardley the previous evening of the possibility, inclined sedately. Sir Tarquin, I shall inquire whether Miss Trevelyan is at liberty to receive you. Pray walk into the south parlour and warm yourself at the fire. He showed Sir Tarquin into the south parlour and went up the south library passage to Eleanor. Eleanor heard Mr. Lockstone's report at the writing table with the candid attention she gave to estate matters. She inclined gravely. "Mr. Lockstone, pray show Sir Tarquin into the south parlour. I shall come down in 10 minutes. Be so good as to ask Mr. Penlow to attend me at the parlour table. Ask Mrs. Yardley to sit at the parlour corner at her sewing, and send a candid note across to Reverend Wenlock at the parish vicarage, requesting that he attend at the South Library next door, against the possibility of a clerical witness being wanted within the half-hour. He may come at the garden door." Mr. Lockstone inclined. "Very good, Miss Trevelyan." At 10 minutes to 12, Eleanor came down to the south parlour in her ordinary morning gown of unadorned dove-grey half-mourning with the clean white linen collar. She had pinned the Brockmere small jet brooch of her great-aunt's at the throat. She wore no ring. Her chestnut hair was pinned beneath the lace cap. The slate-coloured eyes were settled and direct. Mr. Penlow followed her into the south parlour and took the upright Welsh Marcher's oak chair at the parlour table at her right elbow. Mrs. Yardley followed at 3 paces and sat at the corner sash window with her sewing in her lap, her sensible grey eyes direct upon the visitor. Reverend Wenlock, at the South Library next door, settled at the second leather chair with his prayer book open at the visitation of the sick, a sober pretext, at the South Library writing table. Sir Tarquin rose at Eleanor's coming. The quizzing glass swung at the black silk ribbon. He bowed in the oily provincial fashion of a man who had bowed at many indoor parlours. "Cousin Trevelyan, I am infinitely obliged that you are at liberty to receive me at so candid a notice." His voice was indoor, oily, the consonants slightly slurred by the brandy taken at the chaise stage at Bishop's Castle. "I had hoped to do you the honour of waiting upon you sooner. Family business has detained me at Powys these 3 weeks past." He inclined again. "Permit me, ma'am, to offer my belated condolences upon the loss of our late dear aunt." Eleanor inclined gravely from the upright chair at the parlour table. She did not give him her hand. She did not invite him to sit again. Mr. Penlow inclined at her elbow. "Sir Tarquin, I have received Mr. Felton's letter of the 28th of January at Furnival's Inn. Mr. Penlow of Lincoln's Inn is my solicitor, and has been my late great-aunt's family solicitor these 19 years past. He attends me at the parlour table at the present hour by my own invitation. I am informed by him of the substance of your proposed proceeding and of the grounds put forward." Sir Tarquin had not expected the candid opening sentence. He recovered with an oily acknowledgment at Mr. Penlow and seated himself, without invitation, at the candid chair opposite Eleanor. He laid the quizzing glass against his eye and let it fall again. He set his hands upon his knees. "Cousin Trevelyan, I had hoped that we might dispose of the matter between ourselves in a candid family fashion, without the necessity of recourse to the gentlemen of the law." He inclined oilily at Mr. Penlow. "Mr. Penlow will doubtless acknowledge that family compromises are generally preferable to the costs and the publicity of Chancery proceedings. I came up to Brockmere this morning, ma'am, in candid hope that you would suffer me to lay before you my own view of the case, and that we might arrive at a settlement convenient to us both. I am, as Mr. Felton's letter will have indicated to you, willing, in the family interest, to accept a candid sum in cash, and a sober annuity in compromise of my claim upon the estate. I will not press for more than is the minimum at law." Eleanor heard him through without lifting her chin. She did not stir at her chair. The fire settled. Mrs. Yardley at the corner did not lift her eyes from her sewing. "Sir Tarquin." The voice was candid, sober, neither raised nor lowered. The slate-coloured eyes did not waver. "You have my answer in one sentence. My great-aunt Lady Margaret made her will at Brockmere on the 14th of August last in the fixed and candid mind of a woman of 77 years. Mr. Penlow holds her instructing letter of the 1st of July 1819 and Dr. Mountford's affidavit of soundness of mind of the 11th of August 1819. The settlement of 1769 was a strict settlement for 2 generations and is long spent. Your proposed chancery proceeding is without foundation at law, and I shall not pay 6d to secure its withdrawal. Mr. Lockstone, his lordship is leaving us. Good day, Sir Tarquin. She did not rise. She did not raise her voice. She did not weep. She did not deliver a second sentence. Mr. Lockstone, who had been at the south parlour door at the half-opening, inclined deeply. Sir Tarquin, your chaise is at the south sweep, sir. This way, if you please. Sir Tarquin's florid jowl had gone first scarlet and then white. The quizzing-glass swung at the ribbon. He opened his oily indoor mouth. He shut it again. He gathered up his gloves and his hat from the parlour table. He inclined, stiffly, without grace, at Eleanor, at Mr. Penlow, at Mrs. Yardley at the corner, and was shown out of the south parlour by Mr. Lockstone. He did not speak. The south door fell to behind him with the established Brockmere click. The wheels of the hired chaise turned upon the gravel of the south sweep at 20 past noon. The chaise rolled back down the long beech and elm avenue toward the lodge gates and the lane for Powys. Mr. Penlow at the parlour table laid his hand candidly upon the green baize. He did not smile. He inclined gravely at Eleanor. Miss Trevelyan, I shall write to Mr. Felton this evening at Furnival's Inn, requesting the formal confirmation of withdrawal of the proposed bill within the fortnight. I expect his second-day post. Mr. Penlow, pray do. That evening at the South Library writing table, Mr. Penlow drafted his letter to Mr. Felton in the candid Lincoln's Inn fashion. He laid before Mr. Felton the substance of the morning's interview, the candid refusal of Miss Trevelyan to entertain any compromise upon a proceeding without foundation in law, and his own formal requirement that Mr. Felton acknowledge by the return post Sir Tarquin's withdrawal of the threatened bill. He sealed the packet at 9 and gave it to Mr. Lockstone for the Monday morning post-rider. Mr. Felton's reply came up by the second-day post, Wednesday the 16th of February, to the Hall by the morning post. Mr. Felton wrote in candid professional acknowledgment that Sir Tarquin had, upon his counsel's strong advice, given at Chambers on the Tuesday afternoon, following receipt of Mr. Penlow's letter, decided to withdraw the proposed proceeding altogether. Mr. Felton would confirm the withdrawal in formal style by separate letter under his own hand and Sir Tarquin's signature within the week following. Mr. Felton concluded in a candid, sober paragraph that he was much obliged to Mr. Penlow for the candid production of the supporting papers, and that he hoped the matter might be at an end without further inconvenience to Miss Trevelyan or to the Brockmere estate. The formal withdrawal letter, signed at Furnival's Inn by Mr. Felton and by Sir Tarquin Brockmere on the Saturday the 19th of February 1820, in the presence of 2 clerks, was carried up to Brockmere by the mail coach and arrived at the Hall by the morning post of Tuesday the 22nd of February 1820. Mr. Brand brought it up the South Library passage at 10:30. Eleanor took it at the writing table. She read it through once. She laid it sober at her elbow upon the green baize. The threat was at an end. Mr. Penlow stayed 2 further days at Brockmere at Eleanor's invitation to settle the residual estate correspondence and to attest the closure of the Felton file at his own hand. He took his breakfast at the South Parlour, walked the South Terrace with Eleanor at 10, sat at the South Library through the morning, dined at 1. On the Friday morning of the 25th of February at 8:30, Mr. Penlow took his place in the hired chaise at the South Sweep for the post-coach at Bishop's Castle and the mail-coach onward for London. Eleanor inclined gravely at him from the south door. Mrs. Yardley at 3 paces. The chaise rolled down the avenue. Eleanor returned to the South Library at 9. She laid up the fire. She drew the writing-chair to the green baize. She took out the Brockmere account book at her left elbow, the household ledger at her right, and the Felton withdrawal letter laid sober at the front of the desk between them. She opened the account book at the February household page. Mrs. Yardley had set down the month's disbursements in her sensible indoor hand: bread, mutton, candles, coals, the smith's reckoning, the laundress, the parish poor rate. The total at the foot of the page was £48, 11 shillings and 4pence. Eleanor read the entries through. She took up her pen. She dipped it. She wrote at the foot of the page, beneath Mrs. Yardley's hand, in candid italic, "Allowed and signed this 25th day of February 1820, at Brockmere Hall, Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan." She sanded the page, blew the sand off, and closed the account book. She did not rise. She did not celebrate. She did not weep. She laid her gloveless hands upon the green baize between the account book and the withdrawal letter and looked out at the south library sash window. The afternoon was cold, pale blue. The leafless elms at the south sweep stood unstirring. A rook lifted from the topmost branch and was carried off west toward the Radnorshire hills. Eleanor was sensible only of a settled hush at the south library window, the established Brockmere hush of a fire, well laid, and a desk at its proper order. Her great-aunt's portrait, lately come up from Cardew, was not yet at the south library fireplace. That restoration was an Easter undertaking. The slate-coloured eyes returned at length from the window to the green baize. She set Mrs. Yardley's ledger at the side, drew the Brand Farm accounts before her, opened the quarter-day inventory at her left elbow, dipped her pen, and went back to the candid Brockmere business of the day. The folded Felton withdrawal she laid at the inner drawer of the writing table under her great-aunt's first instructing letter of the 1st of July 1819, where the candid family record at the Hall should keep them together for any after-comer who might wish to read the matter through. The pen moved at the fool's cap. The fire settled. The Welsh Marches afternoon kept its established sober order at the south library window. The last days of February 1820 came up across the Welsh Marches in a sober, pale grey light that promised the gradual return of the spring. At Brockmere Hall, the household kept its accustomed hours. Mrs. Yardley had her upper maids at their duties by the 6:30. Mrs. Pendlebury had her loaves at the oven at the 7 o'clock hour. Mr. Lockstone laid the morning letters at the South Library writing table at the 8:30. Mr. Brand came up to the south door at the 9 o'clock hour with the week's accounts under his arm, and by the 9:30, the new mistress of Brockmere was at her own writing table at the South Library window, the ledger open at her left hand, the estate correspondence laid sober at her right, the silver inkstand drawn forward upon the green baize. Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan had not, in the 6 weeks since her arrival at the Hall, altered any practice that her late great-aunt had set. She had inquired of Mrs. Yardley at the second day what hours the late Lady Margaret had been used to keep, and had taken those hours for her own. She had asked of Mr. Lockstone which sash at the South Library Lady Margaret had been used to sit at, and had drawn the writing-table to that sash. She had judged it the proper office of an heiress at 22 years to learn the inheritance before she undertook to alter it, and she did not propose to alter it at the present. The household routine settled, accordingly, by the close of February, into the form it would wear through the spring. Estate correspondence and the household ledger from the 9:30 to 12 at the South Library writing table, the noon meal at the small south parlour with Miss Hattie Yardley, the Home Park walk with Mr. Brand at the 1 o'clock hour upon the Monday and Thursday, the village reading class at the parish school at 3 o'clock on the Wednesday and Friday afternoon, by Reverend Wenlock's settled arrangement, a sober supper at the south parlour at 6, the South Library reading hour with Miss Hattie from 7 to 9, her own commonplace book at the candle from 9 to the 10:30. Sunday morning service at St. Lanver's at the 10:30. The hours of the Brockmere clock struck above this arrangement without alteration. The reading class at the parish school was the office Eleanor had sought of Reverend Wenlock at her second Sunday at Llanfair. She had asked him candidly, after the morning service of the 23rd of January, whether the parish had any village school for the elder girls. The Reverend had answered, in candid clerical gravity, that there was a parish reading room at the schoolhouse, to which 6 village girls came up on the Wednesday and Friday afternoons by his own arrangement, that he taught them their catechism at the 3:30, and that the elder mistress, Mrs. Davies, who had read with them on the Bible, had been carried off in the November past of a low fever, and the place at the slate book had not been filled. Eleanor had inclined, and asked whether she might take up the reading class through Lent and Easter. The Reverend had acquiesced with a candid gratitude he did not pretend to conceal. She had begun on the Wednesday afternoon of the 26th of January, with Maria Edgeworth's parents' assistant under her arm, the small cloth-bound volume she had brought up with her from Bath, and the parish school slate book of Reverend Wenlock at her elbow. The 6 girls were Megan Pugh, aged 11, Bethan Vaughan, aged 12, Catty Lloyd, aged 10, Anwen Phillips, aged 13, Gwyneth Williams, aged 11, and Jane Morgan, aged 12. They sat at the long oak deal table in their unadorned Welsh marchers' print frocks under clean white linen pinafores, their slates upon their knees. Eleanor inclined at the door at her first hour. She gave them the smaller of her 2 judicious smiles. She sat down at the head of the table. She opened the Edgeworth at the first tale of the volume, called The Orphans, and she began to read. She read with them, that first afternoon and at every afternoon after, in her sedate Bath schoolroom voice. She read a passage aloud. She heard each girl in turn read 4 lines back. She corrected the pronunciation gently and at no length. She asked them 3 sensible questions upon what they had read. She added by the second week some small French, the verb avoir, the verb être, the days of the week, at the half-hour before the catechism, and from the first afternoon of Lent, some small Latin, the first declension, mensa, the verb amare in the present tense, at the quarter-hour following. The girls received the instruction with candid, sober gravity. They were docile, sensible, and at the 3rd week, perceptibly less anxious at the unfamiliar phrases than at the first. Reverend Wenlock observed at his vicarage tea on the Friday afternoon of the 11th of February that he had not, in his 18 years at Llanfair, perceived the parish schoolgirls so settled at their hour. Eleanor inclined and did not pursue the remark. Miss Hattie Yardley became, by the first week of February, Eleanor's chosen companion at the South Library reading hour from 7 to 9 each evening. Mrs. Yardley had at first proposed that Miss Hattie should take her supper at the housekeeper's room, as she had been used to do. Eleanor had answered, in candid gentleness, that she should be obliged if Miss Hattie might take it at the small south parlour with herself, and sit with her at the South Library through the reading hour after. Mrs. Yardley had acquiesced. Miss Hattie came up to the South Library each evening at 5 minutes before 7, took her sewing-basket to the second sash window, and sat at her embroidery while Eleanor read. They read together, through the late winter and early spring, in the proper Welsh marches manner. They read William Cowper's Task at the first fortnight, Eleanor reading aloud the long passages of the garden and the winter walk, while Miss Hattie's hand worked at a white linen christening cap for her cousin's youngest. They took up Maria Edgeworth's Belinda at the second fortnight, and at the 3rd week of February, when Mrs. Yardley brought up the parcel from Mr. Cadwallader's booksellers at Shrewsbury, they took up the new Walter Scott novel Ivanhoe, lately come down in 3 small cloth-bound volumes from the Shrewsbury Post on the Friday morning of the 18th. They read Ivanhoe through to the close at the candlelight of the South Library, through the first 3 weeks of March. Eleanor remarked candidly, at the close of the 2nd volume, that she preferred Edgeworth at the head for sense, but would acknowledge Mr. Scott, the master of incident. Miss Hattie agreed. Upon the Tuesday morning of the 14th of March, Mrs. Yardley brought up to the South Library writing table, from the long cupboard at the further end of the room, a small foolscap quarto, leather-bound private commonplace book, bound in worn dark claret morocco, with the Brockmere arms at the corner. The housekeeper laid it at Eleanor's right hand at the green baize. "Madam," she said. I had not previously opened it. I had supposed it her ladyship's reading book of receipts and the household. I have this morning, in dusting at the long cupboard, perceived the date at the title page, 1791 to 1819, and I had judged you should be the proper hand to read it through. Eleanor inclined. She turned back the cover. She read the title page in her late great-aunt's own hand. Lady Margaret Wynne Brockmere, her private commonplace book, begun at Brockmere Hall the 3rd of June 1791, in the 53rd year of my age. She read the first entry, dated the said 3rd of June, upon the household at Brockmere and the gardener Mr. Llewellyn's instructions for the south wall roses. She inclined at Mrs. Yardley once, and asked her whether she might take the book through to her own reading at the South Library through the week to come. Mrs. Yardley acquiesced, and withdrew. Eleanor read the commonplace book through over the 7 days following, an hour each morning at the South Library writing table. She read it in the gravity of an heiress, who had supposed, at the cool, clear Tuesday morning at Lincoln's Inn, that she had been the recipient of a stranger great-aunt's bequest, and she read it now with the gradual perception, by the close of the 3rd morning, that the great-aunt had not been a stranger at all, but a woman who had thought of her own mother through the 24 years of their estrangement. The earlier portion of the book, 1791 through to the summer of 1795, was the receipt book and reading notes of a sensible Welsh Marches gentlewoman of the elder generation. There were instructions to Mr. Llewellyn the gardener upon the south wall roses, receipts for blackberry cordial and apple jelly, brief notes upon Cowper and Mrs. Radcliffe and Reverend Paley's evidences. At the page, dated the 20th of August, 1795, the hand altered. There was no entry through the autumn following. There was a single entry of 3 lines dated the 18th of December of that year, in which her late great-aunt had set down only, "I have parted from Cordelia at the August past upon the unhappy matter of Mr. Trevelyan. I do not see at the present how the breach is to be mended. May God forgive me what I have said." Eleanor read it twice. She inclined the page over and read on. The book carried forward through 1796 to 1810, with brief entries of household and reading, at long intervals. The niece's name was not entered through these years. At the page dated the 2nd of October, 1812, the month of her great-aunt's receipt of the intelligence of Cordelia's death, there was a single entry of 4 lines. "I had a letter at the Thursday's post from Mrs. Carrington at Bath. Cordelia was carried off in the April of 1810 of a spring fever, and I had not been told. I cannot at the present write further upon it. 2 years and 5 months. Eleanor inclined the page over. The pages following bore extracts, in her late great-aunt's own copying hand, of letters Lady Margaret had written to her niece through the years of the silence, and had not suffered herself to send. There were 7 such extracts entered through the years 1795 to 1810. Eleanor read each at the slow pace of a daughter who had not previously known her own mother, had been written to. The shortest, dated the 3rd of April 1798, the date of Cordelia's 2nd wedding anniversary, and ran, "My dear Cordelia, I have begun this letter 3 times at the candle and have 3 times put it by. I cannot bring myself to send it, because I have not yet brought myself to acknowledge that the fault of the August past was mine. I shall send it at the hour I have brought myself to that acknowledgement. Your affectionate aunt, Margaret." Eleanor read it twice and went forward. At the leaf dated the 4th of November 1817, the hand altered again. There was set down, in a copying-out hand, sober and unhurried, a candid memoir of the August quarrel of 1795, written in retrospect, 22 years after the event. Lady Margaret had set down what she had said to Cordelia at the South Library on the morning of the 18th of August 1795, the harshness of her own words upon Mr. Trevelyan as a poor Bath curate, not at the rank of a Brockmere. Cordelia's grave answer that she had given her hand at the candid affection of her own choosing, and would not be advised against it, her own further hardness that morning, and her niece's silent departure from the South Library at the close. She had sat down, at last, in her own candid hand, at the foot of the entry. I had been unjust to Cordelia. I had set rank above her affections. I had set the Brockmere family above her own. I had set my pride above her right to the choice of her own husband. The fault was wholly at my hand. I had supposed for 22 years that the breach would be mended at her returning to me. I had not perceived that the proper office of the elder was to have gone down to her at Bath at the August following and acknowledged what I had said. May God forgive me what I have not done. Eleanor read the entry through twice. She laid the book sober at the green baize. She drew one slow breath and let it out. She did not weep. She inclined her head a single degree at the South Library window, where the pale yellow March's light was at the 10:30 of the morning. She took up her own commonplace book at the inner drawer and copied out, in her sedate Bath italic, 3 of the unsent letters from the page of 1798, the page of 1803, and the page of 1809. She closed her own book. She drew the great-aunt's morocco book back across the green baize and read forward. The entries of 1818 and 1819 spoke of her late great-aunt's discreet inquiries through Mr. Penlow at Bath, of his report at the December of 1818 upon Miss Trevelyan at Mrs. Helmsford's reading school, of her late great-aunt's resolve at the spring of 1819 to draw a new will. The entry dated the 12th of August 1819, 2 days before the will's execution. Eleanor read 3 times together. I have made my resolve at the present. I shall instruct Mr. Penlow at the 14th following to engross the will I have written this fortnight, passed at his hand. I shall leave Brockmere to my great-niece Eleanor, Cordelia's only daughter, as the only redress at my power. I cannot give Cordelia back to herself. I cannot give back the 22 years. I cannot give back the unsent letters. I can give her child the house in which her own mother was a girl, and the income that she has been at want of these 3 years past at Bath. It is not enough. It is what I have at my hand to give. May God receive it as the offering of a woman who has perceived her fault, too late to do better. Eleanor read it through, the 3rd time, in candid gravity. She copied that entry into her own commonplace book. She turned the leaf over. The next page bore a careful pencil drawing of a young woman of 16 years, in a sober muslin morning gown of the late 1780s, seated at the South Library window with a book at her knee. The drawing was dated at the lower corner in Lady Margaret's hand, Cordelia at the Hall, October 1790. Eleanor looked at the drawing for some minutes together. She perceived in it the slate-coloured eyes that her own glass each morning gave back to her. She had not before seen any likeness of her mother taken before the age of marriage. The small ivory miniature at her own dressing-case had been done at Bath in 1797. She closed the commonplace book at the close of that morning. She laid it sober at the inner drawer of the South Library writing-table at her own right hand. She had been gratified beyond what she had expected at the recovery. She would not at the hour attempt to speak further of it. On the Wednesday afternoon of the 22nd of March, Eleanor took the morocco book up to the parish vicarage at Llanfair Waterdine and laid it before Reverend Wenlock at his tea-table. The Reverend's housekeeper, Mrs. Bevan, had set out the silver tea service at the 4 o'clock hour. Eleanor drew the commonplace book from her reticule and set it at the tea table. "Reverend Wenlock," she observed, "Mrs. Yardley brought this up from the South Library long cupboard on the 14th of the present month. It contains my late great-aunt's candid memoir of her quarrel with my mother in the August of 1795, the unsent letters she had written through the years of the silence, the entry of the 12th of August 1819, in which she set down her resolve to leave Brockmere to me, and a careful pencil drawing of my mother at 16. I had not, before this fortnight past, perceived how candidly she had thought of my mother through the years between. I had judged it proper to bring the book up to your hand at the present." Reverend Wenlock drew the book toward himself, opened it at the page Eleanor had marked at the 12th of August, and read in candid clerical gravity at the spectacles. He read it through twice. He lifted the spectacles a fraction and set the book sober at the table. "Miss Trevelyan," he answered, "I am gratified that you have brought it to me. I observe in candour upon 2 points. The first is the candour of your late great-aunt's account of her own fault, which I had not previously perceived her to have set down at her own hand, though she had spoken to me upon it at her bedside the autumn past. The second I had not at the hour been at liberty to communicate to you, and shall now, that on the Tuesday afternoon of the 7th of September 1819, at a sober visit I had paid her at the South Library, your late great-aunt observed to me, I recollect the phrase, of her own resolve at the late will. Reverend Wenlock, I have done what I can for my lost Cordelia at the hand of her child." She used the phrase, "lost Cordelia," twice in our hour together. I had not until the present moment been able to set the phrase against the entry of the 12th of August at this book. The two reflections do square. Eleanor inclined her head a single degree. She did not speak for some seconds together. The vicarage clock at the south wall struck the half-hour. She drew one breath and let it out. "I am obliged to you, Reverend Wenlock. I had not known. I shall hold the phrase in candid remembrance." Reverend Wenlock returned the commonplace book at the half-hour following. They drank a second cup of tea together, and Eleanor walked back down the village lane to the hall at the dusk of the March afternoon. Mrs. Yardley's nephew, Owen Bevan, 3 paces behind her with the parish lantern. Lady Day Quarterday fell upon the Saturday morning of the 25th of March. It was the first quarter-day under Eleanor's ownership. The home farm tenants paid their March rents at the South Library at the 10:30 in the accustomed Welsh marches manner. Mr. Brand brought up the accounts at his hand. He set them out at the green baize at Eleanor's right elbow. He read them aloud sober, line at line, in his candid Salopian voice. Receipts. From Mr. Penrice at the home farm, the March quarter's rent, £180. From the parish rectory, rent at the Advowson, £15. From Mrs. Hughes at the village tenement at Llanfair Waterdine, £12. Total receipts at the chest at the present hour, £207. Disbursements. Servants' wages at the half-year, £86. Parish coal allowance, £14. Parish school subscription at the half-year, £6. Household provisions at Mrs. Pendlebury's account at the month past, £18. Sundry small disbursements at Mr. Brand's hand, £50. Total disbursements, £174. Net to the Brockmere chest at the quarter-day, £33. Eleanor read the account through after Mr. Brand. She inquired of him upon 2 of the disbursements, the parish coal allowance, which had been £4 in advance of the December quarter past, and Mrs. Pendlebury's monthly provision figure, and received candid answers upon both. She acquiesced. She drew the silver inkstand toward her, took up the goose quill, and signed her name at the foot of the quarter-day account in candid Bath italic, Eleanor W. Trevelyan, at the place Mr. Brand's pencilled cross had indicated. The first quarter-day under her ownership stood signed. Mr. Brand inclined gravely, gathered the accounts, and withdrew at the 11 o'clock hour. Eleanor had not, on the cool, clear Tuesday at Lincoln's Inn at the 4th of January, foreseen that on the 25th of March she should be signing her own name to her own quarter-day account at her own South Library at Brockmere Hall. She inclined her head 1 degree at the window and went forward with the morning's correspondence. Upon the Tuesday morning of the 11th of April, Mrs. Yardley brought up to Eleanor at the South Library writing table a small black-bound parcel of her late ladyship's, sealed at the housekeeper's worn brass key and tied with a strip of black silk ribbon. She set it sober at the green baize and stood at 3 paces distance. "Madam," she said, "her late ladyship gave this into my keeping at the 18th of November past, 6 weeks before her departure. She asked at the codicil that I should set it before you upon the day I had judged you to have settled at the Hall to your own satisfaction. I have judged the day at the present." Eleanor inclined and asked Mrs. Yardley to stay. She drew the parcel forward, untied the black silk ribbon, lifted off the worn morocco lid, and drew back the inner cloth of soft white cambric. The cloth was wrapped about a parure of 3 rows of pearls of moderate size, and worth, sober, even, of a March's gentlewoman's choosing rather than the great pearls of a London court, with a clasp of worked silver bearing the Brockmere arms in miniature. There was a folded note of foolscap at the lid in her late great-aunt's hand. Eleanor took it up and read it sober. The Brockmere family pearls. Brought back from the East Indies in the autumn of 1789 by my late father, the 7th baronet at the close of his Indian service. Given to my own mother at the December of that year. Given over to my own keeping at her departure in 1798. I had worn them through my own elder years at the proper Welsh marches occasions. I had supposed at one season that I should bequeath them, with the Hall, to my niece Cordelia. The pearls go now, with the Hall, to her child. Margaret W. Brockmere. Eleanor read it twice. She lifted the pearls at her 2 gloved hands. She perceived in her glass at the South Library sash the candid weight of an heirloom that had hung at her late grandmother's throat in the November of 1789. She did not at the hour put them on. She laid them sober at the cambric, restored the cloth, and set the box at her own right hand. "Mrs. Yardley," she observed in candid, sober gratitude, "I am obliged to you for your judgment at the day. I shall lay them at my dressing-case at the south wing. I shall wear them, in the proper Welsh marches manner, at the Easter Sunday service." Mrs. Yardley inclined gravely and withdrew. Eleanor carried the parcel up to her own dressing-case after the noon meal, and laid it sober at the inner drawer beside the small ivory miniature of her mother taken at Bath in 1797. Easter Sunday fell upon the 16th of April. The morning came up over the Welsh marches at a warm, pale yellow light, the South Park elms at their first April leafing, the Brockmere walled garden at its first cream damask roses against the south wall. Eleanor came down to the south parlour at the 9:30 in the unadorned dove-grey wool morning gown of her half-mourning, the parish convention having now eased her to the half mourning, permitted at the Welsh marches at Easter. She wore the Brockmere pearls at her throat above the clean white linen collar in candid, sober dignity, and she had pinned at the bodice a sprig of cream Welsh marches primrose Miss Hattie had cut for her at the south wall. She walked down the Home Park Lane at the 10:15 to St. Lanvair's with Mrs. Yardley 3 paces behind and Miss Hattie at Mrs. Yardley's elbow. The parish church at Lanvair Waterdine was full at the Easter Sunday morning. The Brockmere pew was at the south aisle, second from the chancel. Eleanor took her place at the corner of the pew and inclined gravely at Reverend Wenlock at the chancel. The Reverend read the Easter service at the 10:30 in his sober Salopian voice. He preached a brief sermon upon the resurrection text from the 20th of John, The parish sang the Easter hymn at the close. The service ended at 12. Eleanor came out at the south porch with Mrs. Yardley and Miss Hattie at her elbow, Reverend Wenlock at the porch greeting the parish. The April light was pale yellow and clear upon the porch stones. The parish drew out at the lych gate at degrees. At the porch step, a gentleman of 39 years, whom Eleanor had not previously seen at Lanvere, drew aside from the parish file and inclined deeply at her and at Reverend Wenlock together. He was tall, lean, 6 feet 1 upright. His hair was a dark walnut, cut close at the nape, with one streak of pure silver above the left temple. His eyes were a deliberate sea green, the colour of the Salopian rivers in November. His mouth was candid and grave. His skin was faintly weathered, fair beneath the weathering of a landowner who rode his own acres. He wore an unadorned dark walnut country morning coat over a plain buff waistcoat, white cravat, charcoal pantaloons. Upon his right hand was a heavy ducal signet of worked gold, a stag's head over a sprig of mountain ash. He carried his hat at his left hand. He observed, in a candid, sober voice at the gentle Salopian accent of the Western Marches, "Miss Trevelyan, I had heard at Mrs. Yardley 3 months past of your arrival at Brockmere. I had not wished to come at the south sweep before you were settled at the Hall. I am gratified to be at the porch this Easter morning." Eleanor inclined candidly. Reverend Wenlock drew a half-pace forward and made the introduction in the proper Welsh Marches manner. "Miss Trevelyan, may I present Lord Aldous Truthwell, 5th Duke of Lanvere Cardew, of Cardew Castle 10 miles to the west. His Grace was your late great-aunt's nearest titled neighbour these 11 years past." Eleanor inclined candidly the second time. Lord Truthwell inclined a degree deeper. He observed in the same sober voice, "I had known your late great-aunt since the May of 1809, when my own father, the 4th Duke, brought me over from Cardew at my accession. I was gratified to learn at the November past of her bequest to her great-niece. I shall not detain you at the porch this morning. I had wished only to make my introduction at the parish hour. Good Easter Day to you, madam." He inclined the third time, set his hat at his head, took his leave of Reverend Wenlock with a brief, candid word, and withdrew at deliberate pace to his own dark green Cardew carriage at the further side of the lych gate. The carriage drew off at the west road at the 12:15. Eleanor inclined gravely after it once and turned back to Reverend Wenlock at the porch. The Reverend observed only in candid clerical gravity that he had been gratified to make the introduction at the Easter hour, and walked her with Mrs. Yardley and Miss Hattie at her elbow down the lych gate to the Home Park Lane. They walked home along the Home Park Lane to the Hall at the 12:30, Mrs. Yardley 3 paces behind. The Welsh Marches afternoon was warm, pale yellow and clear. The South Park elms were at their first April leafing. The Brockmere walled garden showed its first cream damask roses at the south wall as they came up the south sweep. At the lower bend of the Park Lane, Mrs. Yardley drew a half-pace closer and observed candidly, in her sensible Welsh Marches voice, "Madame, His Grace is a widower of 6 years' standing. His late Duchess Cymbeline went of childbed at the castle in the November of 1814. He has one surviving daughter, the Honourable Charlotte Truthwell, aged 10 years at the present. He has not been at the parish at any Easter porch these 6 years past." Eleanor inclined her head a single degree. She did not press the housekeeper further. She walked at her sober pace up the south sweep at the warm April afternoon, the Brockmere pearls at her throat, the cream primrose at her bodice, and went in at the south door at the 1:45 without further remark. Saturday, the 22nd of April, 1820, came up over the Welsh Marches in a cool, pale blue forenoon that warmed by degrees to the mild gold of a true Salopian spring. At the South Library writing table at Brockmere Hall, Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan had finished her morning correspondence by 12:30. At 10 minutes before 3, Mr. Lockstone came up the south stair in his unadorned black butler's tailcoat and announced, in his sedate Brockmere fashion, that Lord Truthwell's carriage had been seen at the lodge gates. Eleanor laid her book aside. She rose from the upright chair, smoothed the dove-grey half-mourning gown at her wrists, settled the clean white linen collar at her throat, and went forward to the south landing. The Lanvere Cardew travelling carriage drew up at the south sweep at 3 o'clock by the South Hall long case. Mrs. Yardley, in her unadorned dove-grey serge and clean white linen cap, the chatelaine of keys at her hip, went down at Mr. Lockstone's elbow to receive the party. Lord Aldous Truthwell, 5th Duke of Lanvere Cardew, descended first. Tall and lean at 6 feet 1 upright, dark walnut hair cut close at the nape, with the one streak of pure silver above the left temple, sea-green eyes of a deliberate gravity, candid grave mouth, faintly weathered fair skin from estate riding, the Lanvere Cardew ducal signet at his right hand. He was dressed in an unadorned dark walnut country morning coat over a buff waistcoat. He handed down his only daughter at the carriage step. The Honourable Charlotte Truthwell, 10 years of age, came down the step in a candid, careful manner that did not betray her hand at her father's. Soft, chestnut-brown hair, plaited in 2 braids, tied with sage-green ribbons. Candid, sea-green eyes that were her father's exactly. An earnest, amiable mouth, dressed in an unadorned cream-and-sage, sprigged muslin morning frock with a sash of sage ribbon at the waist. She made Mrs. Yardley a careful curtsy at the south sweep. After Charlotte came Lady Gwenllian Truthwell, the Cardew Dowager. 66 years of age, dark walnut-grey hair, beneath a fine white lace cap, sensible blue-grey eyes, slender at 5 feet 6 upright, in unadorned half-mourning dove-grey silk. She inclined to Mrs. Yardley with the established graciousness of a woman who had been the Cardew Dowager since the 4th Duchess's passing in 1816. Mrs. Yardley curtsied in a sober Brockmere fashion and led the party up the south stair to the south library, where Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan was standing at the south sash window in candid self-possession. The introduction was gravely conducted. Lord Truthwell inclined deeply at Eleanor. Eleanor inclined back. Lady Gwenllian made a sedate dowager's curtsy, and Eleanor returned it in the careful Brockmere manner. Charlotte, brought forward by her father's hand at her plait, looked up at Eleanor with frank sea-green attention and made an earnest curtsy of her own. Eleanor inclined to the child with a gravity exactly suited to 10 years of age, and Charlotte was at once gratified. Mrs. Yardley brought up the tea-tray at 3:30. The South Library fire was at a sober middle burn. The beachy portrait of Lady Margaret, the great-aunt who had bequeathed Brockmere to Eleanor 27 weeks before, looked down from above the fireplace in oil-paint composure. Lord Truthwell took the upright leather chair at the writing-table corner. Lady Gwenllian took the wing chair at the fire. Charlotte was given a footstool at her great-aunt's knee, and the tea was poured. "Miss Trevelyan," Lord Truthwell observed in candid gravity. The green calf commonplace book of his late father, the 4th Duke, laid sober at his knee. "I had been gratified to learn, by Mrs. Yardley's report through Reverend Wenlock, of your settlement at Brockmere these 3 months past. I had known your late great-aunt, Lady Margaret, since the May of 1809, when my own father, the 4th Duke, had brought me over from Cardew on his accession. She had been a candid, sensible neighbour to me these 11 years. I had been particularly gratified to learn of her bequest to her great-niece." Eleanor inclined gravely. "Lord Truthwell, my great-aunt spoke of your family in her commonplace book, under the date of November 1818, as the most established and amiable neighbours of Brockmere. I had been sensible from her own hand of the regard." Lady Gwenllian, from the wing-chair, remarked that she had herself called on Lady Margaret at Brockmere at the September of 1819 with a basket of Cardew pippins 3 months before her cousin's passing. She had spoken to me then, Miss Trevelyan, of you. She had said, in her sober Brockmere fashion, that she had at the last understood her duty. Eleanor acknowledged the dowager's report with a sedate inclination of the head. I am obliged to you, Lady Gwenllian. The reflection accords with the candid pencil note at the foot of her commonplace book. Charlotte, who had been silent at her great-aunt's footstool through the formal exchange, here ventured forward in a candid, clear voice. Miss Trevelyan, Papa said you read in the South Library at 1 o'clock every afternoon. May I come over from Cardew on Tuesday afternoons to read with you? Papa would let the carriage bring me at 12:30 and fetch me again at 3. She turned her chestnut head up to her father in earnest appeal. Lord Truthwell observed that the request had been Charlotte's own, formed at Cardew on the Thursday past, after his report of having met Miss Trevelyan at the Easter porch. Eleanor inclined to the child. Miss Truthwell, you shall be welcome at the South Library reading hour on Tuesday afternoons from 1 to 3. Mrs. Yardley shall be at the chaperonage, and Miss Hattie Yardley at her sewing at the second sash window. We shall begin next Tuesday with the New Scot, if you have not yet had it. Charlotte acquiesced earnestly. Lord Truthwell inclined gravely in candid acknowledgment. The visit broke up at 4:30. Lady Gwenllian gave Eleanor a kind blue-grey look at the south landing, and observed that Brockmere had been well served in its new mistress. Lord Truthwell inclined to Eleanor at the south door. Eleanor inclined back. Eleanor went up to the South Library and watched the Lanvere Cardew carriage roll down the home park to the lodge gates. The cream damask rose at the walled garden was at its first soft bud. Tuesday afternoons through May and June, the Cardew carriage came over at 12:30, set down the Honourable Charlotte Truthwell at the South Sweep, and returned for her at 3. Charlotte sat at the South Library reading hour with Eleanor at the writing table, the new Walter Scott at her elbow, the Edgeworth Tales at Eleanor's. Mrs. Yardley sat at the wing chair with her account book. Miss Hattie Yardley sat at the second sash window with her sewing. The child's reading improved under Eleanor's careful hand. Charlotte read aloud the Ivanhoe Tournament chapter through the first Tuesday, the Edgeworth Tale through the second, and by the third Tuesday she was reading with the gravity of a child who had been listened to. On the Wednesday afternoons of May, Lord Truthwell rode over from Cardew at 2:30 on the dark walnut hunter that was his accustomed mount, for Charlotte came over also on those Wednesdays at her father's request, that he might collect her at 3 on his own ride home. He sat the half-hour at the South Library with Eleanor and Charlotte across the writing table. On the 4th Wednesday of May, he observed that Charlotte's reading had gained in candour and steadiness under Miss Trevelyan's hand, and that he had been sensible of it at the Cardew nursery hearth on the evenings she had come back to him. Eleanor acknowledged the report with a sedate inclination. On the last Wednesday of May, after Charlotte had been handed up to the South Landing into Mrs. Yardley's care for her shoes, Lord Truthwell stood at the South Library writing table at his hat and asked Eleanor candidly, in a voice that had the gentle Salopian accent of the Western Marches and the deliberate gravity of a man at 39 years of widower's settled deliberation, Miss Trevelyan, would you be at home to me on the Saturday afternoons through June at the South Parlour? I am no longer in my first mourning for the late Duchess Cymbeline. She had been gone these 6 years. I am sensible of the alteration that has come over my own house since your arrival at Brockmere, and I should be obliged if you would suffer me to attend on you in candid form at the South Parlour from 3 to 5. Eleanor at the South Library writing table in candid self-possession, the dove-grey half-mourning at her wrist and the firm Trevelyan mouth at sedate gravity, answered without hesitation. Lord Truthwell, you may call on Saturdays at the South Parlour from 3 to 5. Miss Hattie shall be present. Lord Truthwell inclined deeply. He took his hat. He went down the south stair to his hunter. The Saturday calls through June were sober, deliberate, gravely conducted. Lord Truthwell rode over from Cardew at 2:30, took tea with Eleanor and Miss Hattie at 3:30, and at 4, the afternoon being warm, pale blue and the home park at its first June flowering, was suffered to walk Eleanor on the home park lane to the South Coppice and back. Miss Hattie Yardley walked 3 paces behind in her unadorned dove-grey print cotton. They walked in a deliberate Salopian gravity. He spoke of his late father, the 4th Duke, and of the home farm at Cardew. She spoke of her late mother, Cordelia, and of her 3 years at Mrs. Helmsford's reading school at Bath. He spoke of Charlotte's mother, the late Duchess Cymbeline, who had died in childbed at Cardew in November 1814, the infant having lived only 7 hours. Eleanor inclined gravely. She spoke of her own late father, Reverend Cuthbert. He inclined gravely. By the last Saturday of June, Lord Truthwell had observed to Mr. Penlow by post that he intended at the first July Saturday to ask Miss Trevelyan for her hand. Saturday, the 1st of July, 1820, at 3 o'clock at the South Parlour. Lord Truthwell came up the south stair at his usual hour. Mr. Lockstone showed him into the south parlour. The fire was unlit. The afternoon was warm. Miss Hattie Yardley was at the second sash window with her sewing. Lord Truthwell did not take the upright chair across the parlour table. He went forward to the rug at the upright country chair at which Eleanor was seated in her dove-grey, half-mourning. He went down upon his right knee at the rug, that he might be at her level. He held in his right hand the green calf commonplace book of his late father, the 4th Duke. He spoke in 7 careful sentences, in the deliberate Salopian cadence of a man who had rehearsed nothing and meant every word. Miss Trevelyan, I had not, when my father presented me to your late great-aunt in the May of 1809, foreseen this. I have loved you, with what dignity I could, and with what slowness the spring required, since the Easter Sunday South Porch of St. Lanvers of the 16th of April. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have loved you steadily through the months that have followed, to do me the honour of becoming my Duchess. You have known me too short a time to be in love with me yet. I shall not press you on that. I ask only that you consider the question at your own time and answer me upon your own terms. If your answer is no, my Saturday calls shall continue undiminished while you shall suffer them, and the question shall never be raised again. Eleanor sat at the upright country chair. Her gloved hands were folded at her reticule. The slate-grey eyes did not waver. The firm Trevelyan mouth did not tremble. She took one breath. She let it out. Lord Truthwell, I shall. Lord Truthwell rose from the rug. He inclined deeply. He took her gloved hand at the parlour table and held it half a minute at the Lanvers Cardew ducal signet, and then he laid it back at her lap. Miss Hattie Yardley, at the second sash window, did not look up from her sewing. Her hand was at her mouth. The banns were read at St. Lanvers by Reverend Wenlock on Sundays the 9th, 16th and 23rd of July, 1820, at the close of the epistle. The same banns were read at the Cardew Castle Chapel on the 3 Sundays by Reverend Trigeth, the Cardew chaplain, 61 years of age, soft white hair finely thinning, gentle Welsh marcher's voice in his unadorned black cassock at the close of the second lesson. The parish at Lanvers Waterdine received the banns with sober Salopian gratification. Saturday morning, the 5th of August, 1820, at 10 o'clock, at St. Lanvers Parish Church at Lanvers Waterdine, the marriage was solemnized by Reverend Wenlock in the unadorned form of the Book of Common Prayer. Mr. Geoffrey Penlow, of Lincoln's Inn, 61 years of age, thinning silver-grey hair, grave grey eyes behind small gold-rimmed spectacles in unadorned black superfine and white cravat, gave the bride away at the south aisle, her own father, Reverend Cuthbert Trevelyan, having been deceased these 3 years past. Miss Hattie Yardley, in a fresh dove-grey print cotton gown with a clean white lace cap, attended as matron of honour at the chancel step. Lady Gwenllian Truthwell sat at the front pew of the south aisle in her unadorned dove-grey silk, half-mourning, the Honourable Charlotte Truthwell on her lap, the child in her sage and cream-sprigged muslin frock with the 2 chestnut braids tied with fresh sage-green ribbons. Charlotte held her great-aunt's hand the whole of the service. In the back pews, in the candid Brockmere mourning blacks they had laid by some weeks since for the wedding, Mr. Lockstone the butler, Mrs. Yardley the housekeeper at the Chatelaine of Keys, Mr. Brand the steward at his Sunday olive drab, Mrs. Pendlebury the cook in her clean white linen Sunday cap, and the 4 Brockmere understaff, the parish at Llanfair Waterdine, filled the north aisle and the chancel benches. The bride came up the south aisle at Mr. Penlow's arm in an unadorned cream Welsh Marches muslin morning gown made for her at the village by Mrs. Beddoes, the Llanfair Waterdine dressmaker, in the customary parochial fashion. At the bodice she wore a sprig of late summer Welsh Marches honeysuckle, pinned in the customary Llanfair fashion. At the throat she wore the Brockmere family pearls, the 3 rows of moderate worth that had been her great-aunt's Indian service inheritance, in candid, sober dignity. Beneath the bodice, hidden at her heart, she wore her late mother Cordelia's gold mourning locket on a black silk ribbon, in candid filial remembrance of the mother who had been laid in St. Michael's churchyard at Walcott in Bath in the April of 1810. Reverend Wenlock conducted the service in his sedate Salopian gravity. The vows were exchanged at the chancel step, the Llanfair Cardew ducal signet at the Duke's right hand and her late great-aunt's modest gold band at Eleanor's left were the only ornaments at the altar. After the blessing, the parish came forward in the south porch to wish the new Duchess of Llanfair Cardew joy. The morning was warm, pale blue and very clear. The Welsh Marches lay west to the Radnorshire hills. The wedding breakfast was held at Brockmere Hall, the Cardew household having come over for the morning at the bride's particular wish that her own house should be the host. Mrs. Pendlebury had laid out the long table at the south dining room in the established Brockmere fashion. Cold ham, raised pie, a sober Salopian honey cake at the centre, Welsh Marches strawberries at the dishes. The parish toasted the bride at noon. The Brockmere ale was drunk at the back tables, and at 1:30 the Cardew carriage took the new Duchess and her husband down the home park to the lodge gates, and over the Welsh Marches the 10 miles west to Cardew Castle, where she was to take up her settled residence as 5th Duchess. Eleanor, now Eleanor Truthwell, 5th Duchess of Llanfair Cardew, returned to Brockmere Hall in the spring of 1821. She planted 3 bushes of cream damask rose in the walled garden at the south wall, as her late great-aunt Lady Margaret had asked be done in the candid pencil note at the foot of the Brockmere Commonplace book's last entry. The portrait of Lady Margaret by Sir William Beechey, lately come up from Cardew Castle, where it had been temporarily hung, was restored to its proper place above the South Library fireplace. The Brockmere quarter-day account went forward at Mr. Brand's hand. Mrs. Yardley kept the household keys. Miss Hattie Yardley, now the Duchess's companion at the South Library reading hour, came over from Brockmere to Cardew 3 afternoons a week. The estate was hers, in the Welsh Marches fashion her own late grandmother had kept all her days. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise. And there are, sober, longer in the asking, of the most deliberate patience in the answering. Stories that begin with a will, sealed in red wax and engrossed in copper plate by Mr. Penlow of Lincoln's Inn upon the 14th day of August 1819, at Brockmere Hall in the parish of Llanfair-Waterdine on the Welsh marches. This was one of them. It began with the Tuesday morning reading at Lincoln's Inn upon the 4th of January 1820, when Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan, 22 years of age, second mistress at Mrs. Helmsford's reading school at Pulteney Place in Bath, sat at the Green Baize writing table opposite Mr. Geoffrey Penlow, and heard her great-aunt's bequest read through in copper plate. It went forward through the mail coach journey of the 12th of January, out of the Bull and Mouth at Aldersgate, up through St. Albans and Coventry, and Birmingham and Shrewsbury, and west by hired post-chaise to Llanfair-Waterdine, and through her arrival at the south sweep of Brockmere Hall on the cold, pale blue afternoon of the 14th of January, where Mrs. Yardley and Mr. Lockstone received her at the south door. It went through the predatory cousin, Sir Tarquin Brockmere's defeat at the south parlour upon the 13th of February, when Eleanor met his chancery threat in candid self-possession at the upright chair with Mr. Penlow at her elbow. It went through the second discovery of the commonplace book at the South Library long cupboard in March, where Lady Margaret's candid mea culpa of 1817 was read at the writing table. It went through the Easter recognition at the south porch of St. Llanfair's on the 16th of April, where Lord Truthwell first inclined to her at Reverend Wenlock's introduction. It went through the Wednesday afternoons in May, the Saturday calls in June, the proposal of the 1st of July at the south parlour rug, and the wedding of the 5th of August at St. Llanfair's. And so, in the spring of 1821, in the walled garden of Brockmere Hall at Llanfair-Waterdine, under the cool, pale blue Salopian sky, Eleanor Truthwell, who had been Miss Eleanor Wynne Trevelyan of Pulteney Place in Bath, the morning she first read her great-aunt's will at Mr. Penlow's chambers in Lincoln's Inn, planted 3 cream damask roses at the south wall in the Welsh marches fashion her own late grandmother had kept all her days.